is Spain.
I don't know why she hasn't knocked on the door. Good evening, everybody. Today is October 6, 2014 at 7 o'clock, and this is a Moscow City Council meeting that we're going to begin. And before I start, I want to recognize there's people in the audience and up here at the podium that's got cake. It just happens to be Tom Lamar's birthday today, so I think what we should do is sing happy birthday to this guy before we get going on anything, and then we'll go from there.
Gina to head it off.
So if everybody would go, I'll lead. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Tom. Happy birthday to you. Hey!
Thanks, everybody.
Very good. Thank you.
I think Tom should stand up and say a few words.
Okay, Tom, would you like to do that before we get going?
Yeah.
Okay.
Take 20, 30
I
minutes,
better
Tom.
sit right here. Well, thank you, everybody. It really is my birthday. My parents called. That's a good indication that it really is. It was a fun day. It's always a fun day when the weather can be as beautiful as it was today with such blue skies. I spent a bunch of time outside when I could, and then it was fun to be able to share my birthday cake tonight. I think it was Dan Carscallon 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago that suggested I bring birthday cake. So there it is. And thanks all for sharing my day with me. I appreciate it. Enjoy. It's a great town.
Very nice, Tom. Many more to come. Now with that, I will turn it over to John for the pledge.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, John. First item on the agenda is the consent agenda.
Mr. Mayor,
Walter?
I ask that item C be pulled from
Okay.
the consent agenda.
We recognize that item C will be pulled from the consent agenda.
Mr. Mayor, I'd move that we'd pass the rest of the consent agenda as one item.
Okay.
Second.
Tom, with the item of C being moved, the rest of the consent agenda will be approved. Motion by Tom, seconded by Walter. We'll start to roll with Wayne.
Aye.
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 Okay, Walter, you have the floor on item C, sir.
Thank you, sir. Item C is the Steiner White Avenue Underpass Concept Professional Services Agreement. The reason for pulling it was that the agreement that was included in the packet and put out publicly was discovered to have an omission in it, and I'll ask Bill Belknap to explain what's been changed before we consider it.
Certainly.
Let's turn the mic on. Section 3A of the agreement that actually specified the compensation and term of the agreement did not include the compensation for the individual phases of the project. Phase 1 of the project, which is the hydraulic and hydrologic assessment of the proposed underpass, is for an amount of $4,200. Phase 2 of the agreement, which is in the concept design and construction cost estimate, is for an amount of $6,200. And Phase 3, that includes wetland delineation and preliminary environmental assessment on the project, is $1,750. Each of those individual phases are authorized and conducted separately. And as we move through the project and determine feasibility, we'll move to the next stage to do design and then finally for the environmental review. So those individual compensation amounts were excluded from the agreement. I actually placed a copy of the corrected agreement at your dais for your review, and that's really the only change in the document compared to what was included in the packet previously.
Thank you, Bill. Questions for Bill?
I only had one question,
Okay,
which my only question was at the very end of the professional services agreement. There was Exhibit A says page 1 of 4 and then page 2 of 4, and then it's the end. So I was looking for 2 more pages.
Not sure why the pages are there. That's the extent of the scope. It describes phase 1, 2,
So
and
it's
3.
1 of 2 and 2 of
Yep.
2, and that's it. Okay.
correct.
So there's no other
There's
thing
no
after
other
that.
pages that are missing.
Okay. I just was looking for 2 more, and thanks. That's it.
Good catch, Tom. With that, I'd make a motion that we approve item C of the consent agenda.
Second that.
Okay, Walter made a motion to approve item C with Dan Criscallion second. I'll start to roll with John.
Aye.
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 Okay, we will move on, folks. The next thing is, on the agenda, item 2 is mayoral appointments. What this is, Clay Ryland, Historic Preservation Commission, college student. See, Clay, are you here with us tonight? Would you stand up? I tried to get here early to see you, but I didn't see you slip in on us, Clay. So nothing's happened yet because I got to get these guys to approve you before we can move forward. But thank you for being here.
I would motion that we approve Clay's appointment.
Second.
Okay, a motion by Dan, second by Tom. I will start to roll with Wayne.
Aye.
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 Okay, welcome aboard, Clay. Would you like to say a few things to anybody? Okay, thank you very much. We look forward to having you on the commission. Okay. Item 3, Domestic Violence Award Proclamation. Before I read this proclamation, there's one thing that I've got to say, and I thought about this over the weekend. Boy, this is something that every single one of us needs to simply stomp out. Male, female, any of us. This is something we just cannot tolerate. Any of us in a society like today. So this is something that we need to work together and unite. If there's anything ever in America or any of our communities, this is the one that we need to focus on and just simply put an end to it. Absolutely no tolerance. With that, I'll read Domestic Violence Awareness Month Proclamation. Whereas domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behavior in intimate relationships used by one partner to exert power and gain over the other, and whereas domestic violence can involve physical, sexual, emotional, economic, or psychological threats or actions, and whereas anyone can be a victim of domestic violence regardless of age, gender, economic status, race, religion, sexual orientation, or education, and whereas the statistics are sobering. Nationwide, 1 in 4 women will experience domestic violence sometime in her life. Over the past year, the nonprofit Alternatives to Violence of the Palouse provided 2,907 free in-person advocacy-based counseling sessions, including 1,350 sessions for clients from Idaho. Domestic violence victims advocates from Alternatives to Violence answered 3,777 emergency hotline calls last year, including 1,559 from Idaho. 53 of those victims and their children found safety in the ATVP's emergency shelter for a total of 528 bed nights. And whereas, due to the reduced funding and other resources, domestic violence programs are strained to keep up with demands for services. And whereas growing up in a violent home can be a significant negative factor in children's development, and whereas Alternatives to Violence of the Palouse works with law enforcement and other local partners to provide help, including shelter to people in Latah and Whitman counties who are affected by domestic violence, and whereas last year ATVP provided 103 educational and regional outreach sessions to some 10,286 attendees, and whereas awareness of the problem is the first step, but is incumbent upon all of us to work together to prevent domestic violence, to respond to the needs of victims, to speak out, and to help ensure offenders are held responsible. Now, therefore, I, Bill Lambert, Mayor of the City of Moscow, do hereby proclaim October 2014 as Domestic Violence Awareness Month in Moscow, and I urge all citizens to help end domestic violence. With that, we have Mary here, and I'd like Chief Duke to come up because I have this proclamation I'd like to award. And of course, you know Dave. This is the proclamation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Did you want to say a few
Yeah,
words?
if I can.
I'm sorry.
No worries.
David, do you want to speak too, or you want to just let Mary take over here? I'm going to go to you.
Okay. I might just wind up having us all circle up and talk about our feelings, so brace yourself, gentlemen. It's about to get touchy.
I'm braced.
You're ready. No, all kidding aside, I just really, I just want to thank you as community leaders, not just within our city, but within your own sphere of influence, within your families, as our elected officials, within your friends, and the impact that you make in your own independent sphere of influence. Your willingness to acknowledge domestic violence as an issue does make it possible for me to do my job. It sends a message that when an officer responds, we want a report made. We want it identified as domestic violence. We don't want it pled down to disturbing the peace. We want it as a domestic violence battery charge. Because a lot of times batterers go unheld accountable because there isn't a paper trail. There's not enough evidence. And I know there's a lot of stuff going on in the culture and the media right now about why do women stay. Well, women stay because sometimes there's not enough support to get out, honestly. And when you're faced with the decision, do I stay or do I leave? And if I leave, then the children are left with a batterer unsupervised because there's not enough history of domestic violence, then we as her community aren't really taking care of our sisters, our neighbors, our friends, right? But you gentlemen are leading. You gentlemen are taking a stand, and you gentlemen are saying enough is enough. Domestic violence is not about bumps and bruises. It is about a systematic depersonalization of another person's soul, their will, and their ability to believe in their own effectiveness within their lives. And it is more debilitating than some addictions. I've done a whole spectrum of helping professions, and I've seen domestic violence be the most pervasive out of all of our social ills. And so I thank you so, so much for doing what you're doing and taking it seriously. So thank you so much for all you do.
Thank you, Mayor. Chief Duke.
Thank you, Mayor, for your comments. I just have a short few comments to make. As a valued community partner in preventing and assisting with domestic violence and sexual assaults, ATVP is always unremitting in helping victims within a supportive, safe, and resourceful environment. Their 24-hour crisis intervention hotline has saved many potential victims from being violently injured or traumatized. ATV has employed a multidisciplinary approach for victims and survivors of all crimes with an unsurpassed emphasis on domestic violence, stalking, child abuse, and sexual assaults. They offer essential medical, legal, and child advocacy, as well as furnishing immediate emergency shelter, confidential victim information, referrals, support, group counseling, community education, and preventive programs, and with the emphasis here, without cost. It is really very important for our department and our community to have these resources, and I want to send a thank you to the mayor and this council for their continued support every year that provides a stipend for their services to continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Duke, and thank you again, Mary, and let's all get to you in a second, Tom, but we'll all just be blunt about this. In our community, we have absolutely no tolerance for it. It's something we just simply need to end, and we will. So we're going to work together on it. If there's anything we can ever do, we will do this. Tom?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. On Friday night, I spent 10 hours, Friday night and Saturday morning, riding with Corporal Shane Anderson from the Latah County Sheriff's Department, a deputy who educated me a lot about many issues around Latah County as we traveled around the county. The last hour, from 2 a.m. to 3 a.m., we responded to 2 domestic violence calls, one in Genesee and then another in Potlatch. And it made it all very real. It's not just Moscow, it's throughout the county. It's great that ATVP is working throughout the county, throughout Latah County and in Whitman County. And I want to second the mayor's calling for ending this kind of behavior. We need to be responsible throughout this community and making sure we end this kind of behavior. So thank you. Thanks for your work too.
Okay, we'll move on now to item 4, which is public comment in the mayor's response period. The next 15 minutes, if anybody would like to get up and address the council, as long as it's not matters that's before us this evening or something in front of the Planning and Zoning or Board of Adjustments, you're welcome to come up and make comment. Come on up, sir. And what we'd like you to do is state your name and your address, sir, when you come up.
My name is J.D. Gilkey. I live at 237 North Asbury. I've been in Moscow for about a year and a half, but I used to live on D Street. And an issue came up when I moved, and I'm concerned about everybody in the city, but every state that I've lived in, and I've lived in about 4 different ones, all city taxes and county taxes are taxed to the property with a lien if they're not paid. Tenants have never paid for city and county services wherever I've lived. It's always the property owner, because the only way you can collect your money is by placing a lien on that property and forcing the person to pay it if they don't pay it. Tenants, particularly here in a college town, they're here and gone, and you're out money. So my proposal is that you pass a ordinance or change the ordinance that there is and put the property tax and county tax, well, you wouldn't do county taxes, but property tax onto the property owner, not to the tenant. And it's just, I got a shock when I got a water bill. I'm thinking, what's this for? That should be the property owner's responsibility, not a tenant. We have not installed the water, we have not installed the electric, we have not installed anything. All we're doing is paying to rent the space. So the property owner should be responsible for all taxes for city services.
Bill, I'm a little concerned, or confused, I guess, would be the homeowners are responsible for.
Probably if I could clarify, it's not a property tax that is being paid by the tenant. It is a fee for water or sewer services that are being received by that household. I presume if we're referring to a water bill, so currently it is the policy of the city to bill the tenant and occupants of the building space and not the owner of the building for utility services. So that is currently, and that has been discussed previously. It's the concept of the landlord-tenant question about who should pay that utility billing cost and some of the implications that the city faces in the high turnover of students and setting up of accounts or collection of non-payment of accounts in those instances. Those accounts that are delinquent or do not pay are placed into collections oftentimes, but those are certainly not collected at 100% rate. That has been a topic of discussion of the council previously in prior rate studies, and I believe that's still a item that the finance department wishes to discuss with the council at some point in the future. At this point in time, I just don't have a time frame or a timeline for that.
And that's something that will be coming up in front of us. In fact, I talked to our finance director just the other day on it, Don Palmer. So it will be something that will be coming forward. There'll be more discussion of it, sir.
Well, some property owners are billed for it, others are not. It should be a level playing field. If you own property within the city, you should be responsible for paying for your services. Not a transient tenant, that's just passing through for college.
Okay, well, thank you for your comments.
You're welcome.
We'll take a look at it. Thank you.
Okay. Other comments? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to item number 5, which is a public hearing proposed amendment of Title 4, Chapters 2, 3, and 6 regarding the fence height and placement standards. Michael Ray will lead us in this. Mike, you have the podium, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor, members of the council. So before you today, we have a proposed legislative amendment to Moscow's zoning code regarding fence height and placement standards. Just to give you a little bit of background, we did have some concern that was expressed from a fence contractor, and that was Pat O'Connell at a previous 15-minute comment period at a previous city council meeting. Basically, the concern was that existing 6-foot tall fences within street side yards were presenting some challenges for people that had those fences constructed within the 60s and 70s when we didn't have really any fencing regulations within the city. And so basically those homeowners are presented with the inability to replace those fences now that they're reaching an age where they're starting to deteriorate, and they'd like to replace those within those street side yards. And so essentially the way our regulations work right now is that you have a front yard setback, which you can't place anything higher than a 3-foot tall solid or 4.5-foot picket fence in. You also have a street side yard, and so this only comes into play on corner lots. And so basically a homeowner would have to place the fence back whatever the setback distance was in their front yard, and they'd also have to place the fence back whatever the setback distance was at the street side yard within those corner lots. And so from that concern, Council directed staff to research the issue and possibly bring forward a legislative amendment, which we have done. And this was reviewed by Planning and Zoning Commission at a previous meeting, which was August 14th, 2014. And this is basically the research that we conducted. And so what we had looked at was variance requests over the past 10 years, and it looks like we had 7 requests during that time period. All of those were approved, 2 for basically allowing the fences to go up to 5 feet in height instead of the total 6 feet in height. And then 5 of those allowed the fences to go all the way up to 6 feet in height within that street side yard. So all those variance requests were approved that were made application for. So also part of our research, we had compared 6 other municipalities within the state of Idaho and the region. So we looked at Pullman, Lewiston, Post Falls, Boise, Coeur d'Alene, and Spokane. Looked at those ordinances, and basically none restricted fence heights in the street side yard. Also, a common observation was that basically they limited any fences within the city to 6 feet in height within residential zoning districts. And so just taking a look at our existing language, so within the farm ranch, suburban residential, R1, R2, R3, R4, residential office, and neighborhood business, basically all of those zoning districts repeat the same language at the end of each section. So looking at fences within those zoning districts, basically can't exceed 6 feet, like we mentioned before, except fences located on school grounds. And then fences constructed within that front yard or street side yard basically have to be 3-foot solid or 4.5-foot picket, which is open rail. And so our current regulations further state that picket fences basically are ones that constitute no more than 1/3 of the fence area. So basically what that means is that you have a 2-inch picket, you're supposed to have a 4-inch opening, which is unrealistic to a lot of people in what they want to do with fencing in their yard. And so staff's basically what we've been telling people is that, it's this typical 50-50 is what you usually constitute a picket fence as. And so that's what it currently states within these sections. We also go on to say that barbed wire fences or other fences constructed in a manner that are hazardous to persons or animals, those are prohibited within those zoning districts. And then we also have a portion that talks about fences installed on top or within 5 feet of fill retaining walls. Basically, if you're allowed to go 6 feet tall, say you have a 4-foot retaining wall that you're building that on top of, well, we don't want a 10-foot wall abutting somebody else's property that they have to look at, so we do 1/2 of the retaining wall, which is basically, if we have a 4-footer, that'd be 2 feet minus, off the 6 feet. And so basically what you're left with is a 4-foot fence over that retaining wall is what the current regulations say. Sir.
Mr. Mayor, Mike, if I may, before you move on, your open rail fence and other open fences where posted material constitute not more than 1/3, I thought I heard you say 50-50 or 50% on picket fences.
Well, we've been flexible in that determination just because, a lot of fencing, you go to Moscow Building Supply or JJ, you're only looking at basically, 3 to 6 foot wide fence posts. And so basically, that would leave you, if you had a 6-foot wide fence post, essentially you'd have a 12-foot space in between. And so if you look at a standard picket fence, usually you're about 50-50.
So the code reads 1/3, but the staff's been allowing 50/50 on pickets?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Looking at central business, general business, and motor business, basically the fence regulations that fall at the end of that chapter, basically stating that no fence shall exceed 6 feet in height, once again exempting out the school grounds. We also have a requirement that says barbed wire fences or other fences constructed in a manner that may be hazardous carry that same language over from the other sections. Then we get to the industrial zoning district. Basically, we limit fences to 8 feet in height within that zone. And we also allow barbed wire to be affixed on top of those fences. Basically, can't be below 6 feet in height, so between 6 and 8 feet, that's basically allowed to be a barbed wire fence. Urban mixed commercial, we have our own set of regulations for that as far as fencing. Basically, as you can read through, there's a very specific design that we're going for in that area, and that's pedestrian, bicycle friendly, and so we want to limit fences as much as possible, and so this is the regulations that are currently within the urban mixed commercial section. Basically, masonry walls around outdoor seating or dining areas, private yard areas, similar spaces. Also allow solid fences if it's used to screen trash or recycling receptacles, and similar limited spaces to set aside or behind the principal structure. We also state that solid fences and masonry walls should not exceed 3 feet in height or are used to screen off-street parking facilities. And so basically what we're proposing to do is take the redundant language after each section and put it all in Chapter 6, which is our supplementary regulations. And so basically we'd be creating a new section under that chapter described as fences, and basically it says the start of the chapter would be fences may be constructed after obtaining a permit from the city, and all fences shall comply with the following standards. And the reason why we're inserting shall be constructed after obtaining a permit from the city is currently within our zoning code we don't have that language stated. So it's inherent that a permit is required to construct a fence, but we don't specifically state that within the zoning code. So moving on to subsection 1, fences within all zoning districts except for the industrial zoning district should not exceed 6 feet in height, except fences located on school grounds, public parks, public utility facilities, and similar public facilities. Fences shall not exceed 8 feet in height from the industrial zoning district. So just carrying over, a portion of that language from what currently exists, as well as the portion from the industrial code section.
John.
Your fences within all zoning districts except for the industrial zone. Well, no, actually, it's with the school grounds, except fences located on school grounds. Does that mean abutting a school ground, or is that a fence put up by the school?
Fence put up by the school.
Okay.
Question?
Go ahead,
Okay.
Mike.
It moves us on to subsection 2, basically fences within farm, ranch, suburban, residential, R1, R2, R3, R4, RO, and neighborhood business zoning districts shall comply with the following standards. Basically carrying over similar language to what we had currently had, fences constructed within the required front yards, and so we basically just state front yards here instead of street side yards like it currently exists. Shall not exceed 3 feet in height for solid fences and 4 feet 6 inches in height for open fences, where the posts and material constitute not more than 60% of the fence area. And so, rectifying the 50% requirement that we've been telling people, as well as providing, some people like horse tack behind the backside of a picket fence, and so technically that material could constitute more than 50%, and so playing it safe, we chose the 60% in order to cover all those instances. And we carried over the same section of the solid fences installed on top or within 5 feet of the fill retaining walls, so basically just that 6 feet in height minus 1/2 the elevation difference between the high and low sides of the wall. Carried over the exact same language within the urban mixed commercial zoning district because that was fairly new when we inserted that zoning district within the zoning code. Moves us on to subsection 4. Fences shall be set back a minimum of 1 foot from adjacent public sidewalks or 6 feet from the back of the street curb if no sidewalk exists. So basically, this is just to put the fencing, a foot back from the back edge of the sidewalk, but comes along our current or recently adopted street standard for sidewalks, which is 5 feet. And so if there's no sidewalk that currently exists in front of the property, basically we're taking that 5 feet, adding on the 1 foot that we're requiring to be set back if there is a sidewalk, and that brings us to the 6 foot from the back of street curb if no sidewalk exists.
Walter has a question here,
Sir.
Mike.
Regarding the 1 foot behind the adjacent public sidewalk, why?
It's basically for safety of pedestrian and bicyclists. If you have a kid with handlebars on a bicycle.
The downtown business area has buildings built right against the property line and up against the sidewalk.
Well, this would be mainly in residential areas.
I understand, but I'm saying that we've got, all of the downtown has sidewalks up against buildings.
Well,
I don't know that I would want to be a property owner that had 1 foot outside of what I considered my yard that I needed to mow, maintain, edge, water, a sprinkler system for my yard. Would have to have more sprinkler system to water the 1 foot outside the fence, I think. I'm just trying to understand the why, Mike.
Well, in downtown, you have a lot wider sidewalks, and so that allows for a little bit more flexibility with that safety concern. We also have the engineering department who issues encroachment permits for fences. So say, within this area, the downtown core, you have 80-foot right-of-ways. And so what that means is that usually your front property line is maybe 10, 15 feet back from the back edge of the sidewalk. And so what we have to do is issue an encroachment permit to allow that construction up to the sidewalk. And that's been our standard operating procedure within Public Works to keep it off the sidewalk by about a foot.
There's one in the neighborhood of my neighborhood that's up against the sidewalk, and I think it looks fairly nice. Bill, did you want to jump in?
If I may, that was a request of the Public Works Department. That is a minimum separation that they are requiring of any fences that require an encroachment permit to be placed in the right-of-way adjacent to a walk. And bless me be able to speak more directly on Public Works needs, but largely the comment had been made that if they ever need to repair or replace the sidewalk itself, they really don't want to have to get into removing or restoring or replacing that fence if they have to demolish the sidewalk in that location. Secondarily, the Planning and Zoning Commission really wanted a little bit of separation from a walk. In this instance, we are now going from generally where you would have a fence adjacent to a sidewalk. It had previously been limited to 3 feet on a solid fence or 4.5 on an open fence. And in a street side yard situation, we are now allowing up to a 6-foot fence that could be in a close to an adjacent public walk. So providing that 1 foot of separation just gives a little bit of clearance so that that fence is not crowding the sidewalk. A little bit of handlebar room if it's a kid riding their bike on the sidewalk and not hitting that taller fence in that location. And also to allow snow removal and other activities to occur without having it directly adjacent to the walk. So those were the considerations of the commission. I could certainly, if Les has anything else from Public Works as to why they require that 1 foot separation on encroachment permits, he could certainly provide that as well.
Okay.
Not to be argumentative, but the sidewalk and the fence belong to the property owner for repair, maintenance, and removal. So, that's theirs. If they have to replace the sidewalk, it's their fence they've got to worry with. The handlebar reason makes the most sense, I think.
Tom, you had
I've been on a few sidewalks in Moscow where riding a bike was, part of the transportation. And it definitely would have made it easier for people to pass each other. If one person's walking and the other person's riding a bike with a handlebar situation, it would have made it easier if the fence were a foot or so off of the sidewalk. So I definitely would support this piece of that proposed change from a theoretical perspective of making that happen.
You want to go ahead and continue, Mike?
I think I was...
You're pretty well done with things here?
Anyway, if there's any more questions, I can
Let's go
continue.
ahead and move on and see
Okay,
what we got.
sure. It moves us on to subsection 5. Basically, fences located within street intersection site triangle shall be constructed in accordance with the city standard construction specifications and drawings as adopted by the council. And this goes along with our new current street standards. We have a site distance, basically triangle at any street intersection basically requires you to go 40 feet back from the curb line extended in either directions. You form a triangle, and basically they just need to be constructed in accordance with our city standard construction specifications and drawings, if that's the case. So basically just inserting that so people are aware. Moves us on to 6. Any fence proposed to be located within the public right-of-way shall require the issuance of an encroachment permit. So right now, we require an encroachment permit anyway, just basically stating that so people have a clear understanding that that's required. And then carries us over to the last section, 7. Barbed wire fences or other fences constructed in a manner that may be hazardous to persons or animals are prohibited. And that's all zoning districts. And then we also include the language about the industrial district, where it may be permitted, where necessary for security, and basically just between the 6-foot and the 8-foot height of those fences, you're allowed to put the barbed wire fences. And so Planning and Zoning Commission did conduct a public hearing, and that was at their September 10th, 2014 meeting, at which time the Commission recommended approval of the proposed amendment to City Council. And with that, staff's recommendation before you tonight is to conduct a public hearing, and upon consideration of testimony received, approve the ordinance under suspension of the rules requiring 3 complete and separate readings, and that it be read by title and published by summary. And with that, I'd certainly be able to answer any questions that you might have.
Additional questions for Mike? I think we're good, Mike.
Okay.
Thank you. And I will open the public hearing, and I will take testimony in favor of this new fence height restriction that we're talking about and what's presented. Please state your name and address, if you would, please, when you come forward.
Victoria Seaver, 121 North Lily, Moscow. So I have basically 4 points. This has been hashed out thoroughly in 3 P&Z meetings, which I attended, including their public hearing. Moscow's fence ordinance is more restrictive than other cities that compare to it, and what I think is that we got caught up in an aesthetics requirement that needed to be scaled back because it would cause considerable hardship to property owners on corner lots. The site triangle integrity is being maintained. Open fences, such as picket fences, contain too much percentage of space to sustain the structure, and now that has been redressed. The ordinance language in multiple zoning areas is considerably cleaner now. My 4th point, which is the one that got talked about so much, and why I'm talking, is about this foot setback from the sidewalk and in between the sidewalk and the fence. So while I like pretty aesthetics, I also like practical and fair to property owners. And for a while, they got hung up on this new element of wanting 2 feet back from the sidewalk and the adjacent fence, which is kind of fine for new property owners, but potentially problematic for older ones, which may not have the large yards we tend to imagine, and may have established shrubs and structures inside the current fence that would be destroyed by pulling the fence further back. So we aren't just talking grass. We're not just talking 2 feet of grass or 1 foot of grass. And some yards are already pretty small for the kids and the dogs to play in. So I wanted no space required between the sidewalk and the fence. Repair room, there's plenty of room for repair work with just 1 foot. People can negotiate the 4-foot sidewalks just fine. Sometimes they don't think so, but I see it all the time, and it's just fine. The Fort Knox effects of getting rows of tall fences are few, and they're not really in rows, so it's not that big a deal. And not all the P&Z folks favored the 2-foot space. So ultimately, they came to a 1-foot space between sidewalk and fence to match the current utility easement, according to my understanding. So even though it wasn't my first choice, that I preferred not having that space there at all, I don't have a problem with putting the 1 foot of space there, but don't put 2 and don't go any further back. And so that's one reason why I'm speaking. And that allows that makes sense across the ordinance because you already have a utility easement, and allows the property owners to get more use out of their property because, as you said, Walter, we're paying for it. So don't go over that 1 foot. You want to get rid of it, fine. Don't go over it.
Thank you, Victoria. Additional testimony in favor? Okay, I will take general testimony or opposition to the ordinance. Okay, seeing nobody rush the podium, I am going to go ahead and close the public hearing and for discussion amongst the councilors. How would you guys like to proceed? Wayne?
Well, I'm glad to see that we were able to take care of a particular problem on the street curbside on corner lots, because there were some instances where some folks were having some problems with failing fences, and with the new ordinance it was an issue. That's why Pat came and the contractor spoke to us about it. So I'm glad to see that we were able to solve that problem, and I think that's the direction that city government's supposed to go. I'm a little dismayed, these are fences, and it seems so complicated just for fences. But, you read through this, and I think the average person would probably have to read through it 3 times to understand what they're reading. It's just a fence, but it is what it is, and I'll certainly support it.
Bill?
Dan?
Yeah, I agree with you, Wayne, but I think it actually simplifies the ordinance because it takes those mentions out of various sections and puts it all in one, so that makes it easier for folks to find what they need to follow. And with that, I'd like to make a motion that we accept the ordinance under suspension of the rules requiring 3 complete and separate readings, and that be read by title and published by summary.
Second.
Okay. Bill?
May I suggest a friendly amendment? The Public Works Director indicated they don't use the term encroachment permit, they use the term encroachment agreement. If you would agree to possibly a modification of Section 6 to strike the word permit and insert agreement, then that would be consistent with terminology used by the Public Works Department.
I am too.
Okay, to strike the word permits and insert...
Strike agreement.
Agreement.
It's an encroachment agreement, not a permit.
Okay. Encroachment. Okay. We've got a motion by Dan and a second by Tom. Discussion on the motion. John?
I was at the same meetings, except the last one I was out of town, of the planning and zoning, and this was discussed thoroughly at all of the meetings, and the meeting before we had the public hearing, somebody on planning and zoning wanted 2 foot. I'm kind of in favor of 2 foot. I can live with 1 foot, and I think other than that, the demarcation, the delineation of all of the issues was handled very well by the planning and zoning, with a lot of help from Bill, the city planner, so I can fully support this.
Okay. Okay, I'll reread the motion that Dan made was to approve this amendment of Title 4, Chapters 2, 3, and 6 regarding fence height and placement standards, with striking out the word permit and putting encroaching agreement in Section 6, and that this ordinance, approve the ordinance under the suspension of the rules requiring 3 complete and separate readings, and read it by title and published by summary. We all have that? We'll start the roll with Wayne.
Aye.
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 Okay, and that passed 5-0, so that is passed now. This is ordinance number 2014-16. Okay, this is ordinance 2014-16. An ordinance of the City of Moscow, Idaho, a municipal corporation of the State of Idaho, providing for the amendment of Moscow City Code Title 4, Chapter 2, Chapter 3, and Chapter 6, providing for the modification and relocation of fence construction standards with the Moscow City Code, providing that the provisions of this ordinance be deemed severable, and providing for this ordinance to be in full force and effect from the date of its passage, approval, and publication according to law. With that, we will move on. Okay. Item number 6 before us tonight is the adoption of the Moscow multi-modal transportation. Kevin Lilly represent. One of the things I'll mention before you start, Kevin, even though this is not a public hearing on this, we will take public testimony if somebody wants to speak when you're done. Okay?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, City Council. We are at the point with our long-range multimodal transportation plan that it's ready, in our opinion, it's ready to be adopted. Moscow on the Move was intended as a 20-year strategy that proposed short and long-term improvements to our citywide road network, as well as the bicycle and pedestrian system and the local transit service. Back a few years ago, we began a competitive selection process. We put out a statement for a statement of qualifications and received 13 responses. We had a panel that reviewed those. We narrowed them down to 3 consultants and interviewed those 3. We ended up selecting a nationally recognized transportation planning firm, Nelson Nygaard, folks from their office in Portland, and their team included transportation engineers, DKS and Associates of Portland, who did the transportation engineering in terms of the traffic analysis and the modeling. Also, another consultant on the team was Alta Planning, who are also nationally known for their expertise in bicycle and pedestrian planning. During the process, we gathered lots of data. We funneled data to Nelson Nygaard and also solicited comments and opinions from a large cross-section of the community. We had a steering committee that includes the following representatives, and I want to read this list. The members of the City Council, the Transportation Commission, Police Department, Fire Department, Planning and Zoning Commission, Gritman Medical Center, the University of Idaho, the Disability Action Center, the North Lake Tahoe Highway District, the Chamber of Commerce Mobility Task Force, the Moscow School District, Paradise Path Task Force, Parks and Recreation, and Idaho Transportation Department. I want to thank all of those folks. Their names are right inside the front cover of your plan, the final version. We also had a technical advisory committee, which consisted of the Community Development Director, the Public Works Director, the City Engineer, Streets and Fleet Division Manager, and the University of Idaho Parking and Transportation Services Manager. Also the Smart Transit Executive Director and another member of the Transportation Commission. Tom Brennan, who was the project manager for Nelson Nygaard. He's also the manager of their Portland office. Tom has a Master's of Science degree in Community and Regional Planning from the University of Oregon and over 20 years of experience in transportation planning. Tom played a leading role in this plan and also in some of the most successful strategic plans around the country. He gets around. He's here to present Moscow on the Move for adoption by the City Council. Please help me welcome Tom.
Tom?
Thanks, Kevin. You never told me we were lucky number 13.
You were.
Excuse me for a minute while I get the presentation up here. Ready?
Okay.
Mr. Mayor and members of the council, it's a pleasure to be here in your fine community again. I think probably one of the best things about working on this project is I've gotten the opportunity to come to Moscow for 2.5 years now on a fairly regular basis. I joke with Kevin here that I'd worked in Pullman many, many times over the last 10 years and never made it to this side of the border. And when I actually got here, I was happily surprised to learn that this was really the jewel of the Palouse here, not your neighbor across the border. So it's been a lot of fun working here in your fine community. So as Kevin laid out, we're at a pretty exciting point in time on what's been a very fun and extensive look into your community transportation system here in Moscow. And I think really a great testament to the value that the community puts into your transportation system and how it affects community lives. There's not a lot of cities around the country of your size that have put this type of effort into developing a multimodal transportation plan. So we want to talk a little bit about why it's important that the community has this type of plan. Really want to stress the amount of input and the type of community input that we've had throughout the last 2.5 years. And then talk a little bit about the components of the plan and how this plan will move forward. I do want to stress that it's a pretty extensive document for the city. Hopefully folks have had a chance to look at it. I know several of you have been very involved. So we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty details, but we want to provide a strong overview of where the plan takes us. So as we initiated this plan, we went through a pretty extensive conversation about why this plan was important. It's clear in our day and age that transportation is really about more than just mobility and getting around, but it's part of recognizing your community vision that's set forth in the transportation plan in terms of how the city grows and how people experience their community. Moscow wanted to be ready to make smart, strategic investments to support future growth. One of the things we know in the transportation business is that transportation funding is increasingly scarce nationally, as well as around the state and here locally. So being ready to jump on opportunities to gain new funding through grant programs is really an important outcome of this plan. We want to make sure we have an equitable transportation system. You've got a really broad set of users of the system here. We want a system that works for everybody and really for all modal options. You've got a lot of people here that come without cars or have limited access to cars for reasons of age or ability or just the fact that they're a poor college student and can't afford one. So we want to make sure we have good transportation options for those folks as well. So some key elements of the project, as I'll talk a little bit more about, we've gone through an extensive public and detailed stakeholder engagement process. Spent a lot of time reviewing your existing facilities, the transportation services that the city and others provide, how people are actually moving about to and from your community. Went through a pretty extensive community transportation needs assessment, both from a database standpoint, but also from the standpoint of really just getting out and talking to people. We prioritized a lot of those needs that we saw and heard through a goal-based process. And I'll talk about developed modal plans for not just your traffic systems, but for pedestrians, for transit, for cyclists, and also started to think about what we call transportation demand management. So this includes capital programming, both in the short and long term. That's proposes a set of capital improvement projects, as well as a funding strategy. So this may be a little hard to see. Basic intent of this slide is to show that we've went through a three-phase process. We've engaged open public meetings at each point in the process, the first being really that data collection and learning about your systems. The second piece being data analysis, and as I'll talk about, we've developed some cool new tools to use as you plan your transportation system and how that interacts with land use here, specifically a travel demand model, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then, the final phase of the plan, really working with that data to set priorities for all of the modes we talked about. Both the technical and the broader steering committee that Kevin spoke about spent a good amount of time at the outset of this process really thinking about what the guiding principles were for Moscow and how you invest your limited transportation dollars. So obviously, mobility and access are at the top of the list. We need to move people around. We want to focus on the places people need to get to and how they get there, which is really that access principle. Secondly, recognizing that your street system is 30+% of the public space in your community, it has a significant impact on the look, the feel, how people experience your city and your public spaces. Some of your best public spaces are your main street downtown. So really thinking about how we can create better streets to create better places for people. Economic resilience. Again, this is something we see more and more these days, communities focusing on the need for transportation to deal with natural disasters, to make sure that their economy stays strong. Land use, connection to land use is very important. Safety is obviously a top priority of this plan. A lot of interest from your community about active and healthy living and the role that transportation plays in that. That's not to say everyone's going to walk or bike, but having that ability and capacity to walk and bike in your neighborhood, in your community, is something that's valued very highly by people in this city. And then obviously the environment and the impacts and effects of transportation on the environment were important as well. So as I mentioned, the plan as you have it in front of you has 4 major modal strategies. So there's a roadway piece that looks at traffic operations. There's what we call active transportation, which is really bike and pedestrian plans and actions. There's a section on parking and transportation demand management, more focused on the downtown core. And then transit is the 4th piece of that. All those are pulled together into a 20-year prioritized work plan with short and long-term actions. That's where the proposed capital improvement plan is housed as well. One thing I would stress is that if you adopt this plan, the capital improvement program is a living thing. It's something that your staff can update regularly as priorities change. As I mentioned earlier, and as I'm sure you well know, transportation finance is a significant challenge these days. So having flexibility and ability to adjust to grant sources as they become available for specific projects is really important in the transportation business. So as I mentioned, we extended a really broad and engaging community outreach strategy during this process that had a number of different source inputs. We surveyed, we met with people, we went out and talked to individual stakeholders. We had actually 3 open houses during the process, 2 of which were designed to help identify key challenges. Both occurred right in this room. We had folks around maps, putting dots on maps, telling us where they thought improvements were needed, where they felt unsafe. We had a very successful drop-in community workshop. We were all day at the One World Cafe. People popped in. Some people sat with us for hours and talked about transportation in the community. Some just came in and let us know what their hot button issues were. We got a lot of really fantastic input from that session. Again, as we've talked about, we've had both a technical committee that we work with on a very, very regular basis, as well as the broader steering committee you see pictured here that we met with regularly throughout the process, and those folks were heavily involved in reviewing and giving us feedback on the document as we move forward. We also conducted a number of one-on-one stakeholder interviews with key groups around the community. Just some general findings from those. Very high level of satisfaction with city services. People were extremely complimentary about the types of investments the city was making, and certainly the city's responsiveness in dealing with transportation problems and issues as they came up. Pedestrian improvements were identified as a very high priority, filling in gaps in the sidewalk network, for example. As many of you, I'm sure, are aware, east-west connectivity in the community is another issue that was seen to be very critical, particularly as residential neighborhoods grow out to the east and people are trying to travel east-west through the community. There's been a lot of talk about bypass. There's been previous work on a community bypass or ring road. We did some additional modeling we can talk about later if you'd like on that. Interest in providing greater grade separation to the Paradise Path, particularly at places like State Highway 8 and 95. A lot of really positive feedback on your fixed route transit system, which is a relatively new addition to the community, but one that people seem to really value. As well as interest in reinstating transit service between Moscow and Pullman. One of our points of data was a community web survey that was open to the entire community. We got about 500 responses to that survey. We also surveyed passengers on the transit system, and about 60% of your riders responded to that survey, which is very high. We used social media, actually quite effectively in some cases. Some of the community workshops, we had a number of people said they showed up because of tweets or Facebook posts. So those were effective methods for us. So as we've identified the strategies and priorities that you see in the plan, all of those things in tandem really are contributing to the recommendations you see here. The guiding principles I talked through, the information that's documented in the transportation fact book, which is essentially a very nice existing conditions document. So if you ever have questions about how transportation works in Moscow, that's your place to go. Then also the travel demand model, which was developed. So I'm going to talk just quickly through each of those kind of 4 sections, and then I want to make sure I leave plenty of time for your questions and discussion. So on the roadway and traffic side, we were modeling towards a future 2035 set of conditions. So one of the things that was done as part of this plan that's really new to Moscow is develop what we call a travel demand model. It's a traffic forecasting tool that most bigger cities, big to mid-sized cities have, but Moscow hasn't had in the past. So as you look to answer some questions about new street connections, things like a new 3rd Street bridge across Paradise Creek or the value of investing in a ring road, this is a tool that really can help to tell you how those types of improvements will change the way people travel by car throughout the community. Some of the kind of key deficiencies or needs that people brought up consistently, and we saw through the data. Again, connectivity improvements. So in your east side street grid, you've got some streets that go through, but a number that don't. So people definitely recognize that as they try to move, particularly east-west through the community, but also north-south. Concern about managing traffic in neighborhoods. We've got a relatively limited amount of intersections in that future year that may have some performance challenges, so we have recommendations about improving those. And then continuing to manage safety, and a lot of those safety issues revolved around where you have high pedestrian crossings on some of your state highways. So really a broad range of solutions that are proposed in the plan, including what we call complete streets, checklists to be applied, some retrofits to existing streets to make them more efficient and safer, some pretty small incremental new grid connections that can actually provide quite a bit of value in maximizing the value of the streets you've already built, traffic calming in neighborhoods, intersection improvements, and some improvements to your downtown streetscape. One of the things that was very clear from all of the meetings we had with the public and involvement from the committees and folks that we talked to is that you live in a community that puts a lot of value on walking and cycling. And that really betrays itself in the numbers as we look at what we call mode split. In other words, the amount of people that use various modes to get to work in this case. We see that Moscow's got a pretty low drive alone rate, say compared to the state of Idaho or even to the county. And also has a fairly high rate of walking and biking, so almost 25 or about 25% of your current residents walk or bike to work, which, compare that to a lot of bigger cities, is very, very high, particularly the walk component. A lot of big cities, if you have a 10% walk share and a 1 or 2% bike share, they're pretty happy. So you guys are bringing a lot of people to their jobs and to school on alternative modes of transportation. We had a pretty extensive discussion with the committee about whether that goal should be raised or not. And I think the result of that was people felt if we can hold to that goal as the community grows, that would be a good accomplishment. So there's quite an extensive list of improvements and policies and programs that would benefit bikers and walkers throughout the community. I think probably among the most important are some educational and outreach components, improvements to wayfinding and signage to help people through your east side street grid, and really starting to think about a little bit broader set of facility types and designs, including something that we'd refer to as neighborhood greenways, which, as we look at a lot of communities around the country, they're really starting to look at using very low volume residential streets as ways to safely move walkers and particularly bikers through the street grid, and do so without creating conflicts with high volume traffic streets. So it makes people feel safer, encourages people who might not otherwise get on a bike, kids, older folks, to come out and use those facilities. They're also very, very low cost. So as communities are strapped for cash, they're finding that's a really good way to improve the amount of people that are biking and walking. So these are some of the key elements of the active transportation strategy. Again, improving that bike network, providing some guidance on how to build streets and intersections that are safe for cyclists, looking at opportunities to provide better transit access by foot. We know we've got, as we invest in transit, if we concurrently invest in getting people there by foot, we make better use of that money we're putting into transit operations. And things like snow management guidelines and really thinking about how Moscow can continue to use its excellent cycling infrastructure to grow the economy. A lot of communities around the nation are finding that bicycle tourism is actually a great way to drive economic development. Transit, again, as I mentioned, you've got a relatively young transit system here. You're operating transit in a state where it's particularly hard to fund transit operations, as many of you likely know, and doing so fairly successfully in a community your size due to a well-developed partnership with the city and SMART and the university and a number of other players who've been willing to put some money into funding fixed route transit here in the community. And the service is actually, for the limited amount of funding you're able to put into it, performing pretty well. When we looked at some comparative metrics to other communities, the number of riders that you're capturing per hour of service investment is actually pretty favorable, or even higher than the peer average that we looked at. So you're doing a good job with what you've got out there. This is a map that shows your existing route structure, the east and west routes, and then shows by size of those dots the number of people that are boarding the system throughout the city. Not surprisingly, you've got a lot of students using the system between the campus and residential housing up on A Street. That's probably the biggest market there for transit and will likely continue to be. So the plan lays out some strategies for incrementally improving transit, recognizing that increased operating funds could be a challenge in the shorter term. These are some of the key transit needs we heard repeatedly from the community and are addressed in the plan. Expanding coverage throughout the community was of great interest, particularly for transit-dependent populations that are living, off those routes or don't have access to the existing service. People would like more service frequency, particularly where the demand's highest. Extending evening hours, weekend service, better access to the places people want to go by transit, in other words. Also a lot of interest in reinstating service between Moscow and Pullman. We spent quite a bit of time looking at that. I think assessment is that the funding is just not there at the moment until some of the funding partnerships are viable again. That's probably a longer term a longer-term action item, but certainly something that people are interested in. And clearly, we can't do any of these things without growing and sustaining funding for transit. So there's elements of the plan that deal with that. I won't spend a lot of time on these, but there's a series of kind of incremental improvements proposed for the system in the shorter term. With some additional operating dollars, it may be possible to create a service structure in the campus and intermodal center area that allows the system to serve the new intermodal center in both directions rather than just one. In the sort of shorter to midterm, with a little bit more operating funds, we think there's some opportunity to create a new route in the southeast that would expand service on Mountain View and 6th, filling some coverage gaps. And then the plan also looks at kind of a fairly unconstrained vision for what a 20-year transit system could look like in this community, really kind of based on the feature that you've got a frequent 15-minute trunk line that runs east-west through the community, connecting some of the key points of demand in the northwest to the university and southeast to the university as well.
Can I throw a question in real quick if you want to go back to that last slide? In your projection for long-term transit and the additional routes you created, you don't have anything really east of Mountain View into the Rolling Hills subdivision. Mm-hmm. Why did you not project something up in there? Just based on the density of the residential development in that area, it's probably not something that's going to support a fixed route transit line. There's some kind of basic cutoff points for the level of residential development that would support all-day fixed route service, and with the how those neighborhoods are being developed, it's tough to see that would be economically viable. On the parking and transportation demand management front, this is a section that is somewhat forward-thinking. You've got a parking system in the downtown today that works pretty well. You've got utilization rates that are where a lot of communities would like to be, busy, but not too busy that it's difficult to find a parking space within a block or two of where you're trying to go downtown. But economic success could change that in the future. Future growth downtown could change that. So this section essentially offers some guidance on future on-street parking management, setting some thresholds for occupancy that, if those were met in the future, you may want to think about implementing some of those actions. So it's kind of a trigger system. Options for establishing some citywide, what we call social marketing. Not exactly a great term, but basically some promotional activities that other cities have been found to be very beneficial in getting employees out of cars and getting to work in other ways. And then to wrap up, the really crux of this whole thing is in the back of your document, which is the capital improvement program. It's a pretty detailed section that provides detailed descriptions of each of the policies or project priorities. Provides implementation detail on those, along with some estimated project costs. There's some maps in there, both for the roadway as well as the active transportation pieces that list some of the priorities. I certainly don't plan to go through these in detail tonight. You see there's a lot of numbered projects and lines on the map. Some of just to point to a couple of the top priorities on the roadway and traffic operations front. We've got what we call the urban corridor improvements, essentially to the west of Jackson along State Highway 8. That's an area where there's quite a lot of pedestrians. It's an area of transition as people are coming in on what feels like a highway into an urban area. So there's a series of sort of pedestrianization and safety improvements that are proposed in that area. The 6th and Jackson intersections, another key improvement that would actually require some right-of-way acquisition to kind of build the full intersection profile that we think's merit in that location. You've got some real conflicts between pretty high bicycle volumes and right turning movements at that intersection.
Mountain View Corridor Road improvements, a project that you've been incrementally building out, is another higher priority project on the roadway side. Similar with the active transportation set of projects, again, there's a pretty aggressive 20-year plan. I wouldn't expect you'd probably be able to implement all these in 20 years. If you do, more power to you, but there are a set of priorities in the plan. So these include some new sort of aspirational elements to the trail system, but also a lot of fairly low-cost and practical improvements to the city grid system. You can see a lot of these sort of finer green lines on the east side, or what we'd call, again, neighborhood greenways. Those are pretty low-cost improvements, moving some stop signs, providing some pretty basic signage or street markings to really help guide people on bikes and foot through the street system. I think another project that you discussed earlier on, a grade separated crossing to the Paradise Creek Trail down here in the vicinity of Lynn and State Highway 8 is another project we heard a lot of interest in, so that's given a fairly high priority in the plan as well. So with that, I wanted to wrap it up, and I'm sure you folks have a lot of important questions as well, so we'll take those now.
Thank you, Thomas, for that fine presentation. I got to share with you last Wednesday, we had a special guest in our town. It was Secretary of Transportation Anthony Fox.
Oh, wow.
And I got a chance to welcome him as he came here to the University of Idaho, and he talked about transportation. In fact, Councilor Tom Lamar was there as well, and some of these very things that you touched, he talked about. He talked about bicycling, he talked about walking, he talked about the transit with buses and so on and so forth, and of course the importance of it. And I got to tell you that looking at this plan over, it's been a work in process over the last several years. We can feel proud to be in a proactive community that's doing this, because there's a lot of communities that are not doing this, in my view, are behind the curve. And so I'm pretty excited about this, and I think it's a well thought out document with a lot of input from various people. There was 3 different phases, and as you said, there was community involvement in all 3 phases, open houses, a lot of discussions. I was in one of them last year. Well before I became the mayor, but there was some very interesting conversations and lots of terrific information. Questions for the council?
If I could respond to that, I guess you're lucky if you had the secretary here, because where he goes, money follows, right?
Well, I got to share with you. I sat right by the guy, and I took every advantage that I possibly could for our little old city here in Moscow. And the neat thing about Anthony Fox is he was a former mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina.
Right.
And so some of the things, that's at a bigger scale than what we are here in Moscow, but, it's the same. You have similar problems whether it's a smaller community or a bigger community, so you never know about how that will work out for us, but that may be something that could trigger some things for us, and I'm sure hopeful for that.
Just one other point to follow up on that, Mayor. I think one of the things we're seeing around the country now is that with the decline of earmarking and federal transportation funding going down, cities are relying more and more on grant sources to fund transportation projects. And if you want to write a grant these days, if you don't have a good plan to back it up, you're in big trouble.
Well, and I don't want to get too taking the thunder away, but he talked about a bipartisan bill with both sides of the party, a $300 billion one, and we need it for infrastructure in this country, whether it be roads or bridges, various highways, streets. And a lot of it has to do with the gas taxes. We build all these cars that get much better gas mileage, and so the gas tax money coming in is less than what it used to be at one time. And so there's got to be ways of trying to find alternative funding to make these things happen. And every community is running into that very thing. So, okay, council. Tom?
Well, we are making sure that Secretary Fox knows all of our needs and all of our modes, from air to walking.
Yep, absolutely.
So it's good to see that. I'm particularly excited to see the large percentages of pedestrian and bicycle use, and I've been sitting here trying to think, well, how can we get that 57% down below 50% so we can say that the majority of our residents use other modes than just the single occupancy vehicle. And I think that your series of slides on the transit could help us get there, could help move in that direction. I think that there's a lot more we can do with SMART in Moscow, and I look forward to seeing us make those changes. So I'm excited to see that. The only thing that was bugging me in the report, I mentioned this to Dan when I was talking, is the front cover has your logo and then it has the City of Moscow logo in that order, and it looks like it says no on the front. And it's a tiny minor point that I think it would be more productive if we said on instead of no, but I don't, that's...
We can take ours off if...
No, you should leave it on there. You did the work. It's great work. I just, it's just a silly, it's sort of like how when Chevrolet tried to sell the Nova in Mexico, it didn't sell because it says Nova, which means it doesn't work or it doesn't go. That's all.
Well, one of the things, Thomas, I'm kind of interested in is asking if there's any public input, any public comment at this time, and there may be some questions that you could answer as if folks want to come up and speak. So
great.
I'm very willing to listen to anybody from the public. If you want to take 3 minutes, it's not a public hearing, but we're always excited about hearing from people. Come on up, Joanne, and you can address us. You'll have to state, although we all know you need to state your name and address for us, Joanne.
I'm Joanne Manita, 203 South Howard, 1 block off 3rd Street on Howard. And I just got a copy. I was trying to download this, and I couldn't. And I finally, they printed out a copy for me, and it looks quite complex and quite well thought out. But I had to zero in on my neighborhood, which is 3rd Street. And I was kind of distressed to see that you're recommending having a motor vehicle bridge over connecting 3rd with Mountain View. And so I looked at some of the details to see, and it's good that you're anticipating having some traffic slowing devices. And I see that you think that by slowing traffic, you're going to discourage 300 to 500 cars from going up 3rd Street. And I think that may be very optimistic. But I was puzzled because at City Hall, with this new connection, you have 200 more cars. And in Van Buren, just 2 blocks further, you have 600 cars. And I was wondering where those 400 cars were coming from. That's one example of questions I had. You also say that for active and healthy living, that enabling people to drive to Lena Whitmore is a plus. I would say that's a minus for active and healthy living because having a pedestrian bridge enables people to walk and bike there, which is much better. You talk about quality of life and the concerns of the neighborhood, but then you never address it again, how it's going to be preserved when you have 500 to 1,000 more cars going up 3rd Street. So what I wanted to say is I went to the open houses. I went to the 2 open houses here, and I went to the one at One World. But I don't think the public has had a chance to see the plan and then ask questions like I am doing right now. I would hate to see you pass it tonight without getting any public input in the plan rather than the process, because we don't know what happened to our questions that we put forth. Mine aren't in here anywhere. And I hope that makes sense, because it's a good plan, but I just think we need some community discussion. So if I have questions like this, and I'm sure other people in my neighborhood will, we have a chance to discuss it. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne.
Would you like me to
Well, why don't we wait and see if we got other folks, Thomas, and then I'll let you respond to that. How's that? We'll see. Other folks want to come up and talk about this multimodal transportation plan? Okay, Thomas, I'll let you address this, what Joanne's concerns were.
Yep, thank you. We actually included a few slides on the 3rd Street assessment that we did, anticipating that might be a question from the community, since it's certainly been an important point of discussion. So this has been an issue I know that's been talked about even prior to this plan. We were asked to, again, take a look at the opportunity to create a connection across Paradise Creek at 3rd Street. And we looked at essentially 3 alternatives within the plan, first being just the development of a pedestrian and bicycle-only connection, so a non-vehicular bridge. The second would be what we call full-access multimodal connection, so a bridge with a travel lane, an auto travel lane in each direction, a bike lane, and a full sidewalk in both directions. And then what we call alternative 3, which is that basically that same bridge, but then introducing a series of traffic calming measures into the neighborhood for 6 to 8 blocks to the west of the new bridge connection. So people that did choose to use that would be more likely to do so if they were taking a shorter trip into the neighborhood versus passing all the way through from Mountain View to downtown, for example. I don't know if you can see this. It's a figure 4.3 in your document in Chapter 4. There's a lot of data up here, so I won't talk to it all. But basically what it's showing us is the results of 3 runs of that travel demand model that I talked to you about, which essentially projects the future year, 2035, traffic volumes onto a number of street segments with each of those 3 alternatives in place. So the blue numbers there indicate that alternative 1, which are essentially a proxy for no change to the traffic system. So we're creating a new bike ped connection, but we're not actually changing the traffic flow conditions. Alternative 2 then is the full multimodal connection with no traffic calming. So you can see that's actually probably the alternative that most balances the traffic flow on 3rd Street, as well as important parallel streets to that, 6th and D Street, which actually do act as sort of major east-west traffic connectors today. So what that's actually doing is actually reducing the volume somewhat on those parallel streets because people aren't having to go quite as far a direction if they're making some of those trips. And then alternative 3 is the full bridge connection with some traffic calming along 3rd Street. So the intent there was we're improving the city street system. We're creating a more robust set of east-west travel options for all modes of travel, but trying to somewhat mitigate the neighborhood that's likely to have the greatest impact, which would be the neighborhood along 3rd there, since they're essentially living on a cul-de-sac today, and they'd be open to a broader part of the city street network if they were to do that. So there's clearly some trade-offs there. The option that we took these 3 options forward in our last public open house and got quite a bit of feedback from at least from the group of people that came to that meeting. The third alternative was the one that we heard the most support for during our public meeting, the full bridge with community traffic calming. There's quite a bit of research and study to show that traffic calming measures such as speed humps, chicanes, mini traffic circles, which are commonly used in places like Portland and Seattle, can actually reduce traffic volumes in the range of 20% or so on that type of street.
Wayne had a question. Wayne?
Well, Tom, while you're on this, I thought it was interesting to see your projections for traffic with the 3 different alternatives. It was 3 or 4 years ago, last May, remember this, we were sitting at a Public Works and Finance Committee meeting, and we were having the ongoing discussion about 3rd Street Bridge. And my question was, I would really like to see a traffic study that tells me how much more traffic would go through the intersection at 3rd and Washington. That's a bottleneck area, and my concern would be that increasing. So I'm glad to see that you did the 3 alternatives. I think it's interesting if you take a look at D Street, and we have an existing at D and Van Buren, existing 6,200 vehicles, and with alternative 1, just a pedestrian bike bridge, that only increases to 6,600. as time goes on. But by going with alternative 3 with a full bridge and traffic calming, it jumps it to 7,200. So I guess the question that we would need to ask ourselves, or staff would have to ask, would be, what would be the goal if we put in a 3rd Street bridge? Is it to reduce the amount of traffic that is on D Street and 6th Street, because 6th Street ends up with the same situation? It actually increases even more because of the traffic calming that's on 3rd Street. And so the question would be, would we want 3rd Street as one of the main east-west arterials, or just a way to get there? But the question I asked 4 years ago is answered. Thank you.
Okay. I think, another thing I would say about this is, while travel demand models are valuable predictive tools for long-term forecasting, they certainly come with a margin of error. And there's a lot of other things that are likely to change over the next 20 years that'll probably have as much impact on how much traffic's on your street as whether you put that that connection in, the price of fuel, behavior patterns of our younger generation, which we see are changing substantially. So,
Walter? Speaking to Wayne's point, Thomas, I have a problem with your graphic there, in that the colored alternatives 1, 2, and 3 are 20-year projection numbers. We don't have one of these that show current traffic flows and what happens if a bridge of any type or with traffic calming were put in. Which you can't really compare the 7,500 existing cars out here by City Hall with what's going to happen 20 years from now if a PED bike-only bridge is put in, or a full-blown bridge, get out of the way, let me through, or a full-blown bridge and then a fence that says you can't go this way, go the other way. So I would think that we've got apples and oranges here. I would prefer to see one, or maybe 2 charts, one that shows the current volumes and what those current volumes do with the 3 alternatives, and another one that shows the projected 20-year, if no bridge is put in, versus the 3 alternatives. I think that would be more meaningful. Whether or not it would answer Ms. Minetta's questions about volumes or Wayne's comments, I don't know until I see it. I presume you have the data to do that.
Well, one of the beauties of going through the effort and expense to develop the model is now the city has a travel demand model that, anytime you go out to further develop this type of project, you can put that tool into play to run a 2020 scenario, or you can use that to do it just exactly what you're requesting there. So I assume were this project to advance, you'd want to do some more analysis of the year of opening conditions and exactly how those would play out. So you've got the tool in hand now to do that.
Tom, you hit a kind of an interesting point. You're talking about we don't know in 20 years. Well, I'll tell you what, I think millennials in 20 years are going to be running the show, in my view. And it's going to be kind of interesting how their approach to things really are, because we don't know that. And there's a pretty smart young group coming up underneath that in 20 years is going to be very interesting.
Yeah, we're seeing there's some fascinating trends in the industry with that millennial generation. Auto ownership down almost 30% since the 80s. Percent people getting driver's license down almost 35%. It's a generation that's driven by the technology that's in their hand. Not, like you and I when we grew up, we wanted to get a car when we were 16, right? These guys want to get an iPhone or a Galaxy or whatever and stay connected on it. Well, so having to drive is a nuisance for them.
I'll give you a quick example. I met a kid that was 18 and didn't have a driver's license. I couldn't hardly believe it. Yeah. And I said, you don't have a driver's license? And he really wasn't interested that, eventually he'll get one. Mm-hmm. But the kid biked and stuff. I thought that was just, I'm thinking back, I could not wait till I got behind the wheel of a car to zoom around when I was a young guy. But it's just a different mindset.
And it's the sharing generation, and increasingly they're having, their expectations are that there'll be shared options for them. They can get a car when they want it, get a bike when they want it, take transit if that's the most convenient thing. So it's a very different mindset about transportation. It'll be interesting to see as those millennials move into middle age how they respond.
Okay. John?
Well, since seems like we have discussed this, I would make a motion that we receive the presentation of the Moscow Multimodal Transportation Plan and that we formally adopt it.
I'll second John's motion.
Okay, John made a motion to receive the presentation, formally adopt the Moscow Multi-Transportation Plan, seconded by Dan. Do we have other discussion before Walter?
Thank you, Mayor. Kevin, please. I pointed out to you today a couple of instances where some data on a couple of charts didn't seem to make good sense, one or two of which I'd pointed out back in the draft. I never got an answer. If we adopt I don't expect it tonight, but if we adopt this, are those still available for consideration in terms of, Mr. Consultant, is this really what we've got out there, or is it misprinted or something?
Your question is this?
If we vote yes, do we lock in what I've yet to be told is really good numbers, or, oops, that's printed backwards and we need to fix it?
Yes and no. The first one of those two issues is a bad number, and the graphic on that particular map, if you recall, at Third and Hayes, needs to be rotated 90 degrees. Okay. Makes it correct. The other I discussed with Evan Corey, who's also with Nelson Nygaard. The land use map that is shown for the future year for the ring road shows some high-density development on that quadrant, and that would be affecting that.
That was taken into consideration?
Yes.
So those numbers you believe are correct?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And then, of course, the comments I made on the last slide that was up regarding the existing versus 2035 data, but I saw Les nod yes, which tells me that the consultant reminded him that he's got the data, and Les can run those numbers for us.
Les, you want to add to the conversation here?
Well, thank you. We'll have to talk with Tom about if that information is already in hand. I think it may be, because typically they're looking at both existing conditions and future conditions. Some of that information is actually on that graph that you're looking at when you're thinking about what's the difference between no bridge and with bridges. That's actually reflected between options 1 and either 2 or 3, depending, for future conditions. What's not shown there is if you were to put a bridge in today, what would that change be today? And so that's the piece that we would have to formulate. I think we can provide that in some form. It may not be, actually in an adopted document map here, but probably something we could just provide as a supplement to this document.
John?
I think we ought to keep in mind that if we accept this plan, adopt it, it's not carved in stone. None of these figures that were put up there, anyone is going to guarantee, starting with our city engineering department or with the consultant. And what they have put out there is what they probably consider to be a best guess or a possible guess as to what happens. And that being the case, a tremendous amount of effort was put into this document. A tremendous number of people were talked to, and their input was asked for and considered before this was written. And consequently, I think that we need a document, as was stated, if we're going to be looking for any sort of federal dollars to do most anything with. We need a plan. If we don't have a plan, our request is just going to be put on the pile with the other requests. That being the case, the plan that we have is probably not perfect, and I'm getting a nod of the head by the guy that had a lot to do with writing that plan. I don't think they're ever perfect. I'm not particularly enthralled with the ring road plan, part of it. But there again, I don't think I need to worry about that ring road because I'll be dead and gone, as everybody in this room will be, before we ever have a ring road.
Hey.
And you'll probably go first, Wayne. Anyway, I do think that we need to act on this. We've been at it for 2.5 years, or the city's been at it for quite some time, and that's the reason I made, after reading it, and it was somewhat of a struggle. It was either that or the latest Jack Reacher book. I did read this, and consequently, I think that we should receive it, and we should formally adopt it.
Okay. Tom had a comment.
I just wanted to ask staff for citizens that would like to get copies of this or be able to review it to the extent that they still can after it's approved. And I'm just trying to address Joanne's comments about making sure that the citizens see what is being developed in this plan.
It's online.
I just wanted you guys to say.
Sure. The finished document is posted on the city's website, and there is a hard copy in the city clerk's office if somebody wants to examine it.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Other questions? Walter, you had something?
Mr. Mayor, not to make John get too wound up much tighter, but I do plan to vote for it, John, and I understand you're in favor of it because you made the motion. I was just asking a couple of questions about whether or not we were freezing some things, that, at least one of which have been mentioned. If that one's not right, we do need to correct it. One thing I would like to point out, just for the public, because it struck me as interesting information. It's got nothing to do with the plan, but it's in the plan, which is that 3,990 persons live in Moscow and are employed outside of Moscow in 2010. 5,100 are employed and live in Moscow, but 5,348 come into town to work. So we have 250 more people that come into town to work over what the number we've got here stay in town and work. And I'd like to thank those on the city staff that do the latter for your dedication to the commute to come work for us every day.
Well, with that being said, John made the motion, Dan made the second. I'm going to start the roll with Wayne.
Aye.
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 Okay, it is passed. We have accepted the plan 5-0. Thank you very much for that nice presentation. It was terrific, Thomas and Kevin. Thank you. Okay. We're going to move on to item 7, which is right-of-way trimming policy. Tyler Palmer, you have the podium, sir.
Thank you. Give me a moment while I get this open.
Good night, Tyler.
Thank you.
Look like an attorney.
Oh, no, well, no thank you now. All right, Mr. Mayor, Council, appreciate having a moment to come and talk about our right-of-way trimming policy for the city of Moscow. Just a little quick background on the trimming policy and how we got to where we're at today. The city of Moscow, within Title V, Chapter 8, has had regulations on the trimming of vegetation. Our vegetation trimming is in line with what is sort of an industry standard around the state for sure and many areas of the country. As far as our clearances that are required, the clearances that we require include clearance over the street right-of-way, also over sidewalks, and within site triangles on corners. It's pretty intuitive for the most part why those things are needed. With over the street way, obviously that's intended to be a travel way. We have vehicles that are taller, moving vehicles, different service trucks, Vista utility trucks, in addition to city street sweepers performing services on these streets. And so it's important that we keep that accessible. We just finished talking about our transportation plan. The sidewalks having the sidewalks clear and an 8-foot clearance on the sidewalk, I think most of us have probably walked in an area where we get pushed out into the street from what otherwise would be a perfectly usable sidewalk because it's been overgrown by vegetation. The site triangles is something that we've talked about quite a bit, very important as we all pull up to that corner and are trying to safely enter the roadway. It's really important that we have those site triangles trimmed and clear so that you can see and pull out safely here in the community. All of this is balanced with Moscow being a city that's very tree friendly. We love our trees. We're an arbor city, and it's something that the city takes a lot of pride in, and a lot of residents take a lot of pride in their landscaping at their homes. And so, since this has been a subject where there is potential conflict because it's something that there's a safety need and an operational need for it to happen. There's also people who are very invested in their landscaping. And so we wanted to formalize our policy and bring it to the council. On a lot of these things where there is, the potential for conflict, we like to be able to bring that before you and have the discussion to make sure that our operations are in line with the desires of the council. So we initially brought this forward in January of this year on the 27th to the Public Works Finance Committee, and it was subsequently taken back with some updates based on recommendations from the Public Works Finance Committee on the 25th and most recently on the 25th of August and most recently on the 22nd of September. I'm going to run through just a few quick items in talking about our tree trimming. The way that we've operationally done it for the past, this will be our 4th years. We have the city divided into 4 areas that you see there on the map on the screen. On a rotation, we do 1 area each year. So the way that we've got the program proposed before you is that trimming would occur in one of these 4 areas per year. Notifications will go out in the fall to the area that is designated for trimming the subsequent spring. That's the first notification that goes out. In the spring, and that notification, what it basically informs the homeowner of the policy, informs them of what their responsibilities are as a homeowner, and encourages them to have their trees trimmed. Lets them know that we'll be coming to do compliance inspections in the spring in the area, and encourages them to have their trees trimmed. It provides contact information so that they can call and ask us any questions. We often arrange meetings at people's properties to review what needs to happen at their specific property if they have questions. We also provide numbers and contacts for certified arborists within the city, so that certified tree trimming services, so that they can know who to get a hold of to have their trees trimmed.
And that's done with a door hanger?
That's done with a door hanger. The initial notification is done with a door hanger. In the spring, when we go out to start trimming, we provide at least a 2-week notice prior to coming through to inspect the area, which is once again done with a door hanger. The initial door hanger goes to all properties. I should emphasize, in the fall it goes to all properties. All properties are notified. When we go back out in the spring, they'll place a door hanger on properties where there is some trimming that would occur if the homeowner doesn't have it taken care of by the time we get there. That door hanger is hung at least 2 weeks before the crews are on site performing the inspections and the compliance trimming. At that point, the crews go out and they just go street by street and cover the area. And what's proposed in the policy is that as the crews go along, if there's minor trimming that needs to take place, they will conduct that trimming. A lot of times it's, there's this branch here, or this one's a little low, or this one's in the site triangle, they might have missed it, and so we perform the minor trimming as we go around. This is one of the proposed differences that we have in the program. Previously, we just did all the trimming, and so it wasn't separated out as minor trimming. We would go through and perform any trimming needed to bring the property into compliance.
John, any question?
Just in the end result of this process that you're using is for safety. It is not for how good the lawn looks or how good the tree looks or anything like that. This is strictly for safety, and if the house owner wants to go for how it looks, that is essentially up to them. And then if your people have given them essentially 6 months to rectify a situation before we go back in.
That's correct. Yeah, John, our crews are trained. They're certified by our city arborist. And so we try and get them as trained as possible to go out and make proper cuts. But tree trimming is not these guys' job 365 days of the year. It's a streets crew. They're streets employees. We do want to do an adequate job, and we definitely don't want to damage people's vegetation. But yeah, our goal is to have it compliant so that operationally and for safety reasons it functions the way it's intended to function. When it was reviewed by the Public Works Finance Committee, there was a request made for us to look at the costs of the program and if it was appropriate to insert some sort of reimbursement to the city for work that was being performed on properties. And so the proposal that we've come back with is that at that notification process, as the street crews go out and perform this compliance inspection, as I indicated, we would perform minor trimming on properties that weren't compliant with the ordinance. But properties that were estimated at that time to take more than an hour of trimming would then be passed along into an enforcement process where they would then receive a certified mailing as a notification and be given the days required by the law and by the ordinance to come into compliance. And so that's the primary difference in the proposal that we have now versus how the program has operated for these first 4 years.
I think there might be a question on that. Do you have?
I heard certified mailing. I was wondering, is that the first communication that the city has with the landowner that, aside from just notice of, hey, this is the year that your area is being looked at, is the first time that a landowner hears that their tree might need to be trimmed in the form of a certified letter from the city?
There's the initial door hanging, Tom, that goes to everybody that you indicated,
right?
Which goes out in the fall. In the spring, there's a subsequent door hanging that goes on any property that is going to need trimming at that point. And so there are two door hangers that are given prior to any certified mailing going out.
Okay.
Walter?
And how long do they have after the certified mailing before the city does it and they get the bill?
There's a 10-day period within the ordinance. If you look under the criteria for trimming reimbursement section, for locations requiring more than an hour of trimming, the owner of the adjacent property will be notified of the violation and given 10 days to bring said property into compliance with the city code.
Okay.
I want to just run through a few of these. It had been indicated, this is an example of a door hanger that we've used before. These would be modified with the passage of this policy to provide some different emphasis. But that's just to give you an example of the door hanger that's gone out. We provide the illustrations so that people can better understand what it is that we're looking for. This is on the reverse side of that same door hanger. There's a separate door hanger for sight triangles. This is where we put those on corner lots where they might have a problem so they understand the difference between a sight triangle and just normal right-of-way trimming and what the extra requirements are for the sight triangle. This helps a lot because a lot of times there's questions about how you measure a sight triangle. We'll often get calls and people are kind of in a panic because they think that a lot of their vegetation is in the sight triangle, and you can show them the curb extension and how it's measured. This is from the EPA NPDES best practices page. It's not just so that vehicles don't get hit by branches. Our sweeping program is really important for maintaining the quality of our stormwater runoff. Keeping our curb and gutter, their stormwater facilities, and the catch basin grates. You'll see, they often get plugged with things, and our street sweepers' ability to sweep the curb and gutter effectively is really important for that. These are just a few examples. You can see how the debris gathers along the edges there, and when we get a compounding problem that we have with this is when we have vegetation that plugs up the curb and gutter. leaves and other debris will then block the curb and gutter, and it doesn't perform its intended purpose, and the water gets pushed out into the street. And the water is actually really hard, especially on asphalt, when it gets pushed out in the street. You can see in this picture where the water's been coming down, and then you can see all the small stones that have been pushed out into the street where the water flows out into the street and then ends up flowing and sitting on the crack between the asphalt and the concrete of the curb and gutter, and it can be pretty problematic for us. This is an example of an area where we had just that. The shrubs that you see to the right of the photograph overhung the curb and gutter for quite a while and backed up, and it actually just rotted about a foot section of asphalt out away from the curb, and we ended up having to go back in and patch the area once the shrubs were trimmed back. Another problem we'll have is it narrows the travel lane, obviously. This is an example where we have 6 feet out from the curb and gutter, we have shrubs, and so then we have a parked car, there's parking allowed here, and so you end up with a parked car out in the travel lane because they're not able to get any closer, and then it gets further exacerbated when there's snow that's built up there, and it just continues to narrow our travel areas. I'm going to flip through a few of these.
The thought occurred to me, one of the things, we all like to plant bushes and stuff, and over years the damn things grow, and they take over everything, and so it's just a natural thing to have happen, and that's what we're talking about, really.
Exactly, and that's one of the things that I want to mention. I know that it's often brought up, hey, you guys are coming out and you're hacking up these trees and you're hacking up these shrubs. That's really not our goal. We don't want to do that. It's not something our guys want to be out there doing or having to make something not look aesthetically pleasing. They're not getting joy out of doing that, but it's just, Mr. Mayor, as you said, over the years when something grows out so far, inevitably when we do go to cut it back, here's an example here. That was several feet out into the travelway. And so there's just not a pretty way to cut that back, because had it been maintained year after year, the greenery's on the front edge, and it's not a problem.
There's no way you can possibly kill those things, because I've cut them back and shut them back for years. You can't kill them. The damn things just keep going.
They're pretty robust.
Yeah.
So here's an example. Yeah, this is a year later of one that we trimmed back, and it's obviously there's not greenery on the exposed edge when we go through and trim, but they do typically come back and grow back, and the guys are really trying to be careful and make it look as aesthetically pleasing as possible. But as was mentioned, we don't have a lot of time, and we're already committing a pretty large amount of time and city resources to doing this. And so the guys are trying to get through in an efficient way. This is just an example of some of the damage that can occur. You see the big gouge on our sweeper there. As many of the council knows, as they looked through the budget last year, we just purchased a new sweeper to the tune of almost $250,000. And this is equipment that we can't just go replacing all the time, that we count on to have working and running. And so it's important for a lot of different reasons.
Tom had a question here first, and I'll go.
Are we intending to have the same requirements for the 8-foot height and so forth over sidewalk apply to the city, say, for example, with the Paradise Path?
Yeah, I believe that would apply to any walkway. That might be,
because I know that we've got a few sections where that probably needs to be caught up with, if that's the case. And if we do, would we have to wait for the rotational thing, or can we just kind of go through and do the entire pathway?
The way that the program's set up we're doing the rotational portion in the areas, and then as we get complaints about an area, it gets turned over just directly to ordinance enforcement. So if it's not a direct safety issue, like if it's blocking a stop sign, then we'll go out and make it safe. We'll go out and trim it. But if otherwise, we just pass it along if it's in an off year for that area to ordinance enforcement for them to look at.
If I may.
Walter? Okay.
If I could just follow up on your question.
Thanks.
This particular policy and ordinance pertains to the street rights-of-way, so streets and alleys, as administered through the Street Department and Public Works. For pathways, that's a parks facility, and so that's something that they would do as part of their normal maintenance of the pathway system, the trail system. So if there are areas like that you've noted that have problems, it's something we should just go ahead and refer to the parks folks, and they can take a look at it.
Well, if we still have the same edge and the 8-foot overhang,
as far as
then it would be nice to see that applied to the pathway too, and sweeping and whatever, those same things I think would help with the decay of the asphalt and the
That's good. Dwight's here tonight, so he's hearing this, and so that's all good. Now, Walter had a question here.
Tyler, can you go back to your current door hanger that you had on your slide?
Certainly.
I think it was maybe your first slide of this series.
There you go.
Yeah, right there. Trimming of these trees and shrubs in the public right-of-way is a requirement of the property owners by ordinance. We're not adding that. We're not changing it. We are speaking to the policy of how the city's going to go through town once every 4 years and effectively do it for them. I believe you told us at Public Works Finance you're talking about $25,000 per year.
That's correct. We've just finished the fourth of four areas.
It's not an unbelievable amount of money, but it ain't cheap. I would like to see your new door hanger have a different approach to it, other than if you wish to perform the trimming yourself or hire your own contractor, please have it done or we're going to do it. I would prefer more emphasis on you need to get this done, and then we're coming through, if I can draw that shade of difference between the wording I see there and what I would feel we probably should lean toward.
Yeah, based on our discussions with Public Works Finance, that's something that we plan on doing, is revising these to place the emphasis on having it done, and that the city coming through isn't coming through trimming, we're coming through to do a compliance inspection. And so we'll ensure compliance at
I'm not
that time,
suggesting so heavy-handed that, they're all of a sudden, up against a wall or anything, but they need to understand that this is a requirement and that we're trying to get this done.
We'll keep the friendly cartoon on it.
There you go.
In preparing this, we did look at several other cities. Every city's dealing with this. We spoke with Coeur d'Alene, with Lewiston, with Pullman, and I feel like we've got a pretty good system proposed here. Lewiston, for example, went through and they had so many problems with it, they hired a tree trimming contractor and just had them go through, do all the trimming, and then bill all the property owners where they had to do trimming. It was very
warning them ahead of time.
It was very unpopular. They had some notices, but then it was, as you can imagine, it was a fairly unpopular thing. They kind of pushed it through, and in speaking with their maintenance folks, they said that they're up against having to do it again because at the time they didn't put a process in place to ensure its continued trimming and compliance, and so they're getting ready to fight the same battle again. So I think it's wise for us to have a policy and something that's sustainable, that we can continue to keep things in compliance.
You have another one.
Speaking to doing it in billing, conversation was held at Public Works Finance about to do that would cost us more than just to go follow this policy. In other words, if you kept time and had to bill everybody that you spent 15 minutes on, and send them a bill and then argue about it and try to collect it and on and on and on, would probably not be worth it. If we want to try to get these rights of ways cleared, I think the policy that's proposed is a pretty good way to go about it. I am, before the discussion's over, going to want to talk about the possibility of getting the council to agree to reduce the 1 hour of 2 men on a truck to 30 minutes. I have done trimming around a fairly large yard, and once I get my equipment out, such as these people would have on the truck, I can do a lot of hedge trimming in a short period of time. So I'm concerned that an hour we may do a quadrant and only bill 2 people while we're doing the rest of it for quote-unquote free. I think that 30 minutes for 2 men in a truck would be a more applicable way to do this, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes.
Wayne,
well, we probably should talk about it now, because I was in front getting ready to make a motion. So, I guess my question would be, Tyler, how did you come up with an hour as opposed to 30 minutes?
We, in discussion with the staff conducting the work and looking at where the numbers would come out based on the formula of the 2 men in a truck and their equipment, what we were trying to capture is where we have had the biggest expenditure of time the most disproportionate expenditure of time. And so we were looking for a clean cutoff, but have that be an amount, as Walter indicated, that in a cost-benefit analysis, we're not spending, more time and money pursuing something that we're just not getting back the reimbursement to justify that sort of expense. And so in looking at that, an hour was selected because it seemed like that would capture most of the properties where we had properties where the guys were spending 5-6 hours sometimes.
And I'm assuming this is at least 2 guys?
2 guys, yeah.
But you've been around town now, Tyler, and done those.
And that's the hope, is that as it's consistent, we really hope that in our next go-through that we have, more people that maintain it themselves, and B, a lot of the really gross offending properties we've perhaps taken care of.
One thing I want to mention to council before anybody makes a motion is even though this is not a public hearing, I'm going to ask for public comment because we may have some folks out there who want to speak on this behalf too, Tyler. So
absolutely.
Bill, or Mr. Mayor?
Yes, John.
Yeah, Tyler, I know that, for example, if you've got a crew out and they are working an intersection, or if someone is on the ground, you have to have somebody standing up and watching. Is that not true?
Yeah, on any work like the tree trimming, we have to have a 2-man crew. There's a minimum of a 2-man crew.
You have to have essentially one working and the other one watching.
Depending on what's being performed, certainly if we have any bucket truck work happening, we have to have somebody who's staying aware of what's going on. Typically what will be happening is one guy will be performing the trimming and the other guy will be watching and also, cleaning up the branches as they go. But yes, depending on the type of work they're doing, having
So
somebody
we don't,
observe that.
essentially, I guess my point is, we don't have a truck, 2 guys get out and they go to work trimming. You would like that to happen, but it doesn't happen that way all the time.
Not all the time.
Okay. Thank you.
Tyler, did you have more you wanted to?
No, that's it for me.
Okay.
So if you
Let's
have any questions.
And I just wanted to ask, the references to guys, 2 guys in the truck is a generic gender thing, right? We're not excluding women from performing.
No, absolutely
Okay.
not.
I just want to make sure.
Hey, the gals can saw a tree down just as well as the guys can.
Okay, I just want to make sure we're clear. Thanks.
Okay, I'm interested in hearing from if there's anybody out in the public that'd like to come up and speak on this behalf, state your name, and we'll give you 3 minutes and your address. Please come on up, Victoria.
Victoria Seaver, 121 North Lily. You've come around 121 North Lily, Victoria Seaver. Hear me? Okay.
You have a soft voice, Victoria.
I do. So you've come around, and so a lot of what I have to say now is kind of reinforcing what I was afraid you weren't getting to, but I'm going to go ahead and make my comments. So there are some taxes that directly benefit one person but not another. Some city services that are of more use to some people and not so much to others, and some ordinances we agree with and some we don't agree with at all. One person feels that a city's trimming of his hedge is disastrous to it and makes no sense as far as one can see, and maybe it could have been done better. Another guy thinks, why should my tax dollars pay for his trim? Another taxpayer like myself thinks that here's a good service of good value that I'm fine having my tax dollars pay for. Gratefully, these city guys and gals, and there is one, have some arborist training and will do as good a job as they can within the very narrow limits of what trimming that they're going to do. It's better for the greenery, it's better for the city, and it's better for the property owner. City tree trimming targets public safety, service accessibility, storm drainage, and infrastructure. But make no mistake, this is not free landscaping services. What the city does is trimming triage. If your tree winds up being lopsided because they only go up one side from the ground 12 feet, you're not getting landscaping, you're getting cut. Sometimes it looks okay. Sometimes it looks bad compared to the rest of the tree or the hedge or the yard. If you want it nice, you pay to get the plastic surgery done, which means you go hire somebody, a real landscaping service to come in and do a full job. I watched some of the city tree trimming last year. And indeed, most of it was 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, gone. A landscaping service will cost you a pricey minimum charge for anything under an hour, and it's not something you even want. It'll go down a lot better if I don't pay through the nose for it. If I've got a jungle to hack through, then I can see paying something. For the purposes of consistency and actual infrastructure need, I consider this tree trimming proposal to be a city service our taxes can modestly handle. At $25,000 a year, because I pay attention at other meetings, is likely to be far less going forward because you've already done the first round of city trimming. And so I consider this a good value. The administrative costs and time spent in collecting peanuts for a snip here and there is penny wise and dollar foolish. Changes to the policy that were presented in this policy are reasonable. Just don't go overboard. Okay?
Thank you. Are there others who would like to come up and speak? You want to read that?
I can do it.
Go ahead, Walter. I'll give you the floor.
We received a email communication regarding this from someone that could not attend tonight, from Jim Fazio, who had comments in the newspaper a couple of years ago regarding the trimming that was being done in his neighborhood. This was written a couple of days ago in response to tonight's item. Quote, "Thank you for the opportunity to comment on the proposed ordinance change that is under discussion. The name of the proposed change is, quote, Community Forestry Criminal Enforcement, unquote. The very name is shocking and seems more appropriate in Moscow, Russia than Moscow, Idaho. The key points I would like to make are these. Number one, we already have a community forestry ordinance, and it is perhaps the best one in Idaho. It protects our city's trees and the beauty and other benefits they provide, while at the same time providing for public safety. Under the current ordinance, the process for dealing with nuisance trees and shrubbery is assigned to the city forester, who is in the Parks and Rec Department, not to the street department. According to the ordinance, when a vegetation problem exists, the city forester is to notify the property owner, and it is the property owner's responsibility for making the correction. If he or she does not comply, then the work can be done by city or a contractor, I presume, and the property owner is billed for the work. Number two, under the current street department process, all vegetation at the edge of a sidewalk or curb is vertically sheared, whether it is creating any kind of problem or not. I do not believe this was the intent of the 8-foot and 12-foot clearance rule in the community forest ordinance. Number three, it is my understanding that it costs the city $25,000 a year for their method of sending crews to one quadrant of the city each year and vertically shearing the vegetation and pruning tree limbs. Under the proposed change, the city would still do this objectionable work, but would charge the landowner depending upon the amount of time needed to do the job, making non-compliance a misdemeanor and assessing daily fines. Number four and final, nowhere in the proposal is community aesthetics addressed or the benefits of greenery and landscaping. To protect residential investment in landscaping and the appearance of our streets, some judgment or discretion is needed rather than the current policy of vertical shearing, whether the vegetation creates problems or not. In conclusion, I recommend that city crews not be used for this purpose of annual shearing. I ask that you reject this process and the proposed ordinance revision, and instead to rely on enforcement of the existing community forest ordinance. The city will save money, crews can be put to better use, discretion can be used by the city forester about what needs pruning and what does not, and how it is to be done. Let's keep Moscow the beautiful and friendly community that it is.
Okay. Last chance for anybody from public who would like to speak on this. Okay.
Mr. Mayor, I have one other communication that came in late this afternoon. This was an email to me from David Rourke, the chairman of the Moscow Tree Commission. Rock, I'm sorry. And said, Walter, would you please consider bringing up for discussion to the council tonight the idea of adding another subsection F to the community forestry ordinance? This would follow the proposed new subsection E. Subsection F would address the need for an appeal process. The scenario may exist where a tree or shrub encroachment into the right-of-way is not actually causing a safety site problem due to extenuating circumstances such as terrain or location of property. The value and aesthetics of the tree or shrub can then be retained. An appeal process is already in place, written within the ordinance section 88A4 to address planting and removal of trees of shrubs in the right-of-way. I talked to Community Development Director Bill Belknap and to City Attorney Rod Hall about this request this afternoon. I am not going to propose that the council act on this request at this time, but that we put this on a future Public Works Finance Committee agenda, give staff an opportunity, Mr. Mayor, to research it further, see if it's either applicable or possible, and then give the Public Works Finance Committee an opportunity to decide about acting on it.
Okay. Dan?
I'll go ahead and make a motion on the first action here, and then we can discuss the trimming, the actual policy. I'd like to make a motion that we approve the ordinance amending the Moscow City Code, Title 5, Chapter 8, Section 11, under suspension of the rules requiring 3 complete and separate readings, and the ordinance be read by title and published by summary.
Second.
Okay, Dan made a motion to approve the ordinance.
Second.
John made the second. John made the second. Figures. Discussion? Okay, I'll read the motion. The motion by Dan was to approve the ordinance amending Moscow City Code Title 5, Chapter 8, Section 11, and the suspension of the rules requiring 3 complete and separate readings, and that the ordinance be read by title and published by summary. And John Weber seconded that motion. I'll start to roll with you, Wayne.
Aye.
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 Okay, that ordinance passed 5-0, and this is ordinance 2014-17. Okay, and that here it is, ordinance 2014-27, an ordinance of the City of Moscow, Idaho, a municipal corporation of the State of Idaho, providing for the amendment of Moscow City Code Title 5, Chapter 8, Section 11, adding a new subsection E, providing for the specific criminal penalties for violating any provision of the Moscow City Code's Title 5, Chapter 8, providing that the provisions of this ordinance be deemed severable, and providing for this ordinance to be in full force and effective from the date of its passage, approval, and publication according to law. Walter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mayor, I would make a motion that we approve the rights-of-way vegetation trimming policy 2014 as presented to us with one change. That change being that under the criteria for trimming reimbursement, bullet number 4 be changed to begin, for locations requiring 30 minutes or more of trimming, the owner of the adjacent property will be notified, etc.
I'll second that, but I want to make sure that we also change it up in the process part. The last sentence of the process mentions it as well.
Thank you.
Okay.
I would agree.
Okay, we have a motion by Walter and a second by Dan to make an adjustment under the process and point number 4 to go from 1 hour to 30 minutes. Is that what you said
Right.
here, Walter? Okay, and in 2 different spots.
Mm-hmm.
Has everybody got that? Okay, start with John.
No. Aye.
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 Okay, it passed 4-1, so that is the change for the vegetation. Okay, so we're going to move on. Before we move on, we are going to take a break, folks. It is 9:18. We will resume at 9:28. Moving on to item number 8, playground equipment installation contract amendment. Dwight Curtis, you have the podium, sir.
Good evening. As you're aware that some weeks back we brought before you an agreement, a contract bid award from Picture Perfect Playgrounds to install playgrounds, tot lots in 3 of our different parks, and that was approved. And then since then, the vendor notified us that they had inadvertently left off a serious piece of that, which was the concrete work. The safety tiles that these will have fit on top of a large concrete pad, and they had missed that. And anyway, and several attempts to try to resolve this so that everybody would be happy with it and still get the work done. We came up with what we believe should resolve most everybody's concerns and still keeps us well within the budgeted amount. And I have a huge PowerPoint for you. It's 2 pages. But the original bid was for $29,958, and that was approved by the City Council, and under this proposal, under this request, that would not change. All the duties that they were supposed to do under that price would still take place. We're proposing to generate an additional task order with concrete, or Knox Concrete. They're a firm that we already have a contract with, and they take care of our sidewalk replacement program. And using their existing unit prices, the cost to put in the 3 pads was $24,524. I put out on your in each of your places before the meeting. It has the breakdown of each of those playgrounds, or each of those parks, and through this, city crews will take care of the excavation work, and then the playground company will come in and install the playground, as well as put in the safety pads. And the total between the two is $54,482, which is well within the budgeted $70,000 for the 3 playgrounds. And also in your packet, you have the line items from fiscal year 14 that will be, or are carried over into 15. So with this, we've got...
Dan has a question for you, Dwight.
Yes, sir.
And maybe it's on your next page, but should we approve this, what's the timing?
It's not on the next page, but of course, you're always, this late, you're always at the risk of the temperatures. There should be no problem putting in the concrete. The issue could arise with the adhesives that hold the tiles down. And so we would no doubt have the concrete down. It's possible that they would not be able to put the tiles in until spring, which would mean they would not put the playground equipment in as well, because, well, just obvious reasons. Right. So, but, I mean, it is October, and it's going fast. You never know what's going to happen.
Too, though.
We're still optimistic, though, and these are small playgrounds.
Wayne had a question, and I'll go to you, John.
Dwight, I assume that the $29,958.19 did include the tiles,
yes,
the rubber tiles.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, John?
Dwight, if we get this constructed as far as the playground equipment, when will the rest of the park be up and going?
Are you talking Otness Park?
Yeah.
Well, they're working on that. Unless other things get in the way, I mean, the plan was still to have grand opening this fall. If we aren't able to get the playground put in, we would need to wait till spring. So we are still on plan for this fall. So it might be a snowy day, but that's still the plan.
Okay. Thank you.
I have a question, but I will let Dwight get page 2 done, and we'll come back to this one with my question.
Okay. Page 2 is just merely the council action, and that is to authorize staff to generate the additional task order with Knox Concrete in the amount of $24,524 for the construction of 3 playground service pads, or direct us otherwise.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Okay, Dwight, this proposal that you just put up on the screen, and if you would back up to the first page, is different from what was in our packet because information was generated after the packet was generated. And I don't know that I have any problem with it. I do have a question for you and possibly the city attorney. The existing bid, the bid we received for $29,958.19 from Picture Perfect was a loan bid, and the bid plans and specs included concrete work. That's a question.
It did.
Okay. Having been told that they will not accept a contract with the city because they did not include money for the concrete work, do what you will, we're not going to do the work. What do we need to do paperwork-wise to close that loop in doing a contract with them for $29,958.19 and taking out the concrete?
I'm not sure, did their proposal, I don't know if it had the concrete work in there.
The proposal that they gave us did not.
So we accepted the contract, their proposal, we did, but it omitted the concrete work.
Correct.
I understand, but, Bill?
I think it'd be my recommendation. If the agreement has been executed, then it'd be my recommendation that a change order occur that would exclude that scope of work at no change of cost, and that would clearly document through the contract chain the scope of work that they're obligated to perform underneath the contract.
That seems to be a reasonable
He
way
was
to do it.
picking up what you're putting down.
Mm-hmm. He got it.
Yeah.
The paperwork trail is correct.
Correct.
Okay.
And then, so the 24 plus is under the standard 25,000 that we would need to go out for bid.
It is.
Tom?
I'm comfortable with this resolution. I think it's a good way to make it happen.
A motion.
I'd make a motion that we do what you said in. No. So I would make a motion to authorize staff to generate additional task order with Knox Concrete in the amount of $24,524 for the construction of 3 playground surface pads.
I'll second that.
And I would also like to add the change order that helps to clarify this piece with Perfect Playground plus Perfection, or whatever they're called.
Pizza Perfection Plus?
Pizza Perfection plus Playgrounds.
And authorize staff to execute a change order to the contract with...
Exactly.
Agreed.
Picture Perfect Playgrounds to modify the scope of work to exclude the concrete work.
Okay, we've got a motion by Tom, a second by Dan, and the change order by Bill.
The change order by Bill that's going to be recommended.
To go with the 24,524 for the concrete work with the change orders. Everybody clear on it? John, we'll start with you.
Aye.
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 Okay, and that passed 5-0. Thank you, Dwight.
And thank you.
So done. We'll move on to the next thing, which is
Craft beer.
Dwight, good thinking.
Yep. Item number 9,
Beer to go
craft
there.
beer and wine tasting and sales at the Moscow's Farmer Market. Kathleen Burns, you have got the podium. We've been waiting patiently all evening, you and a couple of your guests with you, so we're ready to have you.
Okay. In your packet, you had a resolution to allow a pilot project for the remainder of the 2014 Farmers Market to
Is there three left?
There's only 3 left. 11, 18, and 25. And looking at craft brewery and winery in the market, we looked at 3 possible vendor spaces on Friendship Square. And with that, I have Erin Carroll with me, our chair of the Moscow Farmers Market Commission, and Gina, our vice chair. And we did conduct a DOT survey of the public this last Saturday at the market. We have the results from that DOT survey. And we also have 2 potential vendors representing the Moscow Brewery and also Camas Prairie Winery with us in the audience, in case you have questions.
Good evening.
I just wanted to give the results. I spent the full Saturday in the market this past weekend hoping to talk to our patrons of the market specifically about this request. Oh, Kathleen's going to Vanna White this for us. Asking participants to just simply state whether or not they supported bringing beer and wine to the market. I also specified that this is for later consumption. It is not a beer garden open drinking. It is to purchase and to drink later. The results were 365 yeses and 13 nos. So I'll say that again. It was 365 yeses and 13 nos. I had a lot of conversations with people. I admitted this was a nice informal survey meant to bring discussion and talk to people about what they wanted to see in their market, what they liked, any concerns that they had. I can anecdotally tell you many of the comments here. For most of the yeses, the response was, why not? And for the no's, it was generally people who abstained from using alcohol themselves and didn't see any need for it in the market. I'm happy to talk more about what I heard from our current patrons in the market, but overwhelmingly I think the posters and the responses speak pretty clearly for themselves.
Was this past Saturday you're speaking about, right?
It was last Saturday.
Bill?
John?
Well, as a member of the council here and as a person that spent about 25 to 30 years in the beer business, selling and then longer than that tasting, I think this is a good idea. I'm totally for it, and I think although it is not a statistically valid survey, it's quite impressive. And we're not opening or suggesting anybody open up a beer garden. We are talking about the availability of testing small quantities of locally produced wine and beer, and I think it would be a very positive addition to our farmers market. So I would move that we approve the proposed resolution.
I'll second that.
Okay, John made a motion to move to approve the resolution for the craft beer and wine tasting sales at the farmers market on Saturdays. These next three that we're talking about, the 11th, 18th, and 25th. Yeah, with a second by Tom. Walter, question?
Sure. In the presentation of this to the Public Works Finance Committee, there was some verbiage about doing it in Friendship Square, which is a city park, for Vandal Homecoming. We're moving to the Jackson Street parking lot. Do we have a problem?
That'd be for you, Rod.
Doing it in the parking lot?
That's the proposal.
And it's the one that could be a problem someday in the future if it's a permanent on temporary basis. I don't think it's a problem. You do have the authority to do that, and we changed it specifically to say to allow it in that Jackson Street.
I saw that. I just wanted to make sure that we were okay.
But I would think that if this pilot project is successful and we move forward, we would address that issue with the parking lot if we're going to do that permanently going forward year, because Homecoming will be here every year.
Dan?
Yeah, I was down at the market there early, and Aaron asked if I'd like to vote, and I said, well, I'll be voting on Monday, and so I didn't think it was really proper for me to put a sticker on there. I wanted to make sure, Art Betchy's not here tonight, but he wanted to make sure that somebody mentioned the term value added, because that's, I know I'm not going to use the flowery $3 words that Art always uses when he speaks, but, this is something that goes towards, agricultural products being used in another way and offering that for sale at the market. So, any time that we can do something like that, I got cinnamon rolls from one of those. That's another way that this happens. This is just another form of using an agricultural product and offering it up for sale at the market. And I think it's a great idea, and hopefully we can make this a permanent part of it next year.
Just one clarification.
Ron?
Just on that. And when we move it to the Jackson Street, we would not be allowing it in the 4th Street street area. So we would be doing it in the private parking lot And it's not considered a park, but it's not the public right-of-way, and it's not a public street.
Okay. Walter?
I would be remiss if I didn't mention that your 96.5% survey results is 10 points better than the 86% of the people that were visiting the market 3 years ago when we were discussing whether or not to move it from the parking lot to Main Street, both of which are fairly remarkable. So we do good to get anything over 50% happiness on this when this council acts. So.
Okay, well, with that, John made the motion, Tom made a second to pass this resolution for the approval of the craft beer and wine tasting and sale of the Moscow Farmers Market, October 11th, 18th, and 25th. I will start the roll with Wayne.
Aye.
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 Okay, and that passed 5-0, so we will have sampling out there Saturday.
What's that?
Thank you.
Resolution.
It's a resolution.
Not an ordinance, so we don't have
Okay.
speeches. Okay, you're good to go. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you,
Checking
Elaine.
quick.
Nice survey.
Okay, with
Give it to
that,
Stephanie.
No, I don't want it.
that being the last one, we will
Connor?
go on to reports and committee.
You just
Bill?
have the reading of the resolution.
I do have to
The
read it?
resolution number,
Yeah.
what the number is.
What is the number? Okay, that resolution is 2014-18. Gene, yep, 2014-18 is a resolution for that. Thank you very much. Committee reports, Walter, Public Works and Finance, man, that
We
was,
covered all of the Public Works Finance Committee items with the exception of two reports that we got, one from Kathleen and Amanda regarding the canning grant work that was done this summer and the benefits of that, and some video of people attending those training sessions. They do, the arts department downstairs still has some, come talk real quick, just so the public knows and you can get rid of some of that stuff. What have you still got in stock that's available because of the largesse of the, what was the company?
Jarden.
Okay,
Yep. Who owns Kerr and Ball Canning Supplies.
okay.
So we still have product like salsa packets. We have some lids and rings. We have some cookbooks, and we also have coupons.
A lot of discount coupons.
Really good discounted coupons on case jars, lids, rings, pectin.
Okay, anybody wants any of that? Go see Kathleen downstairs. The other report was from Jen Piffner. Jen Piffner on the Vandal Town Gown Block Party report. Everybody felt it was a success. They're going to do a debriefing and making notes and not lose them so they can think about what they want to do better or different probably next year. I'm not sure if the mayor's sold on this, but he may be. And I believe, sir, that's all I've got.
okay, Wayne.
On the 18th of September, I met, the Board of Directors for Smart Transit met. It was pretty much a routine meeting. However, we were pleased to find out that, I'll give you a little bit of history. ITD had messed up the funding for our mobility firm, and they were talking about taking it out of the provider's money, which would have shorted the 2015 budget severely. But that turned out not to happen. ITD said that they would fund it all the way through 1st of April, so the funding, it looks like, for this next fiscal year for Smart Transit is fairly stable. And then on the 25th, the Historical Preservation Commission met, and unfortunately they didn't have an official meeting because they didn't have a quorum. But Mike did present the Fort Russell Reconnaissance Survey, mentioned that it's going to be available for everybody to look at on October 23rd. It's going to be pretty comprehensive, not quite as much as our multimodal transportation study, but it'll have some pretty good information in it. And then LEDC met on October 1st, and they are continuing to look for a new executive director. They do have 4 people that have applied for that position. And the interview committee was attempting to put together interviews of those 4 people. actually this week sometime. So that's what I have.
If I may, a couple of other things. I did attend PBAC on the 18th of September. Discussion there revolved around some comments that have been received from from Washington Ecology regarding some updates of some documents that we had done. We're going to continue to work on that, and IDWR, the Idaho side of regulatory agencies, are going to take a look at it and see if they have any additional comments, so we will be working through that. We did have, and most of us attended, the U of I leadership luncheon on the 29th, discussing things on the horizon for both the University of Idaho and for the city, and things we might do to work together on those. And then I think almost all of us attended the strategic planning session on the afternoon of the 30th with John Luthi. We'll be working our way through that. We are encouraging administrative staff to move that ahead and attempt to have it done in time to have the results of it impact the budgeting process next spring.
Okay, Dan.
All my stuff is in over the next 2 weeks, but I would like to remind everybody that the Bears did beat Lewiston on Friday. So
Good
Bill
job.
and I will pump our fists over that one.
There you go.
And Tom?
The only additional thing I wanted to add was at the Fair and Affordable Housing Commission meeting on Thursday night, we heard from the researchers that have been doing an affordability and discrimination survey within housing, or about housing within Moscow, and they gave us just preliminary results from that, and we'll be writing that up shortly and presenting a full report to the city.
Okay.
So thanks.
John?
I have nothing, simply because as I was leaving the house, I didn't grab my information, so I'm somewhat embarrassed. I will catch up at the next meeting with the urban renewal, with the planning and zoning, and with the human relations committee.
Okay. I have a couple of different reports. One of the things that September 24th, we had an airport board meeting. Walter had mentioned the block party September 26th that we had, and that was a success. And yes, I very much am in favor of doing that again. I thought there were some good comments on that. Walter also mentioned on the 29th, we had a U of I and city leadership luncheon, which was very productive, just talking over various things. And then on October 1st, as I had mentioned earlier tonight, Secretary of Transportation Anthony Fox was here on October the 1st, and I welcomed him into our community. One of the interesting things, I did get a chance to talk to him. And during his presentation, he talked about he was from North Carolina. He was a former mayor of Charlotte in North Carolina, and how North Carolina would always fight with South Carolina and back and forth and back and forth. And he did make the comment he still hated Duke, but because he's a Tar Heel. Anyway, he talked about regions having to get together, working together to make things happen for various reasons with transportation. He gave me the opportune time to give him the example about Pullman and Moscow, the mayor from Pullman, the mayor from Moscow, and both towns collectively working together on our airport realignment, that it's a big deal for us. It may be small in like the vision that he has things to do, but I got a great sense from him and told him, I said, this is going to be a story that's going to come out you may want to follow. So it's going to be kind of interesting. You never know when something like that may happen. Good for our community and our region. So Tom was there and was able to listen to the guy's presentation. So with that, I just wanted to pass that on. And reminder, October 16th from 4 to 8 is a water summit at the Best Western. That's coming up next week from Thursday. Mm-hmm. Bill, do you have anything from the city? With that, folks, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn, Mr. Mayor.
I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
This meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everybody.